18th century, whether they be American, British, or French, all had very similar rations. Congress in 1775 established rations for the American soldiers, and that ration stayed very similar for 150 years. Let's take a look at what was included in that ration. There were several different types of rations. There were per man per day food rations that each man hoped he would get. There were rations per man per week, and then there were per company per week rations. So the daily ration would include a meat component, usually a pound of beef or 3/4 of a pound of pork or possibly a pound of salt fish. So another part of the daily ration would be the bread part. Each man was supposed to get a pound loaf of bread per day. And if bread wasn't available, then they would possibly be issued just flour. And if flour wasn't available, then they might even get a substitution of cornmeal. And to round out this daily ration, they were given a pint of milk and a quart of beer. The per company per week ration included candles, soap, items that the men would need that weren't food items. The per man per week rations were items that weren't as popular or common. Peas, it might also include beans, rice, or vinegar. Whenever possible, the soldiers would also supplement their diet with whatever items they could procure locally from the local village or from farmers or even from the wilderness around them. So in the following video series, we're going to take all these ration items and we're going to prepare them in an 18th century fashion. Soldiers in the 18th century commonly had short rations, and they would supplement their rations. And one of the things they would supplement their rations with was pumpkins, or sometimes they were called pompions. Today we're going to take some pumpkins and we're going to cook them in a couple of different ways. So these first two pumpkins we're going to roast. One I'm going to turn into a pottage, and another one we're going to stuff with pears. Let's start with our pottage pumpkin. I'm going to take out the pith and the seeds. Now we're going to take this flat rock that we've had in the fire for quite a while. It's got a nice flat side to it. I'm going to place those down and then heap coals on top of them. So this little pumpkin isn't going to take very long at all to cook up. But in the meantime, while that's working, let's work on our other pumpkin. So I've got a pear here we're dicing up that we're going to use to stuff our pumpkin with. So if you've got some spices, a little bit of salt and a little bit of cinnamon is the perfect time. We're going to put these on our top of our pears here. And there we go. And mix that up a little bit. I'm going to take our pumpkin and just cut the top of it off. Okay, so that's our pumpkin cleaned out. We're going to take our pear dices, stuff that full. Just so that it'll fill up that cavity. On the very top, I'm going to place some of my precious butter. There we go. And then we're going to place our top back on. So here's our pumpkin. It's ready to go, ready to start by the fire. We've got it all stuffed. And we're going to find a place nice right by the fire and let it bake on one side. And we'll slowly rotate it as it cooks so that it gets evenly cooked all the way around. So while that pumpkin's cooking, let's get started on our last one. So not all pumpkins could be used when they were ripe. There's one account of a soldier who, coming off the battlefield, finds a pumpkin. He finds it green and he slices it up and fries it. So that's what we're going to do with this one. So with this green pumpkin, got it sliced up, we're going to fry it with a little bit of butter and add just a little bit of sugar to sweeten it up. A little bit of salt along with the sugar. And pumpkin loves a little bit of cinnamon. Let's get some butter in our pan and get that warmed up. Well, you got to keep these moving while they're cooking, or else that sugar will burn in there. But these have softened up and they look like they're ready to go. Very tasty. Let's see how our other pumpkin's doing. So these little pumpkins have only been on the fire for 10 or 15 minutes and they look like they're all ready. So we're going to take them off. And they're nice and soft on the inside. So while this is still hot, I'm going to take some butter and melt that in there and then add some milk and it should be ready to go. Maybe a little bit of salt. It's really good. A little bit of cinnamon really set it off. Let's see how our other pumpkin's doing. I think our pumpkin's done roasting here. Let's take this away from the fire to cool just a little bit. Get all of the pears out. See, they've been roasting well in there. Okay. Well, there we've got most of it out. If you've got it, you might want to add just a little bit of butter, maybe even a little bit more salt. Should be ready to go. 3 wonderful, simple ways that 18th century soldiers could cook their pumpkin: a pumpkin pottage, a stuffed roast pumpkin, and my favorite, the fried green pumpkin. It's very common for soldiers in the 18th century, especially when they were on the march. They'd be issued their rations maybe several days ahead of time. They'd be issued several days of meat, and then they'd be issued their flour, their bread ration. And because they were going to be gone for a while, they would likely be given just flour instead of bread, as that would just go bad. And so there they were on the march with not very much equipment to use, and all they had was flour, and they'd have to make some kind of food with it. Today we're going to make a fire cake or ash cake, a very, very simple thing that the soldiers would be able to make with just the flour and a little bit of water. So what are we going to need to make ash cake? Well, number one, we're going to need to have good ashes. We're going to have a really nice ash bed to work with, good and hot. So we don't have very much equipment. We're going to try to do this with 3 different methods. We're going to use a simple bannock board, or if you don't have a board like this, maybe you could just use a half split of firewood that's nice and flat. We're also going to use a method where we put leaves around our fire cake or our ash cake. So all you're going to need for that is some large leaves, like a grape leaf or a large tree leaf, burdock or cabbage leaves, something like that. And the last method, we're not going to use anything at all. We're just going to make our cake and we're going to place them right on the coals. So now our coals are getting really close to being ready to use. Let's make up our dough. I've got a simple wooden bowl here for us to make our dough in, the flour that we've been issued. And I'm going to make up 3 or 4 ash cakes here. If you have any salt available to you, which the soldiers may or may not have had salt that day or that particular time, but salt will add a lot to the taste of your fire cakes. So in this case, we're going to add a good bit of salt to it. And we're going to stir that around while our ingredients are still dry, so it'll be easy to mix. And now we're going to need some water. You want to add enough water to make a stiff paste. And we're going to start out with maybe a little less than we need so that we don't go overboard. For the ash cakes that we're going to cook on the bannock board, we're going to get this to be a little stickier because we need to stick it to the board. It needs to stay there while it's cooking. Okay, we've got our dough mixed up. It's nice and the right kind of consistency. A little stiff, but still sticky enough to work with. And I've got this. We're going to take this one. We're going to flatten it out on our bannock board. We're going to get it nice and thin. The thinner, the better it's going to cook. We need to make sure that it's sticky enough that it sticks to the board. Our board's got 2 holes in it so that we can prop it up. Let's put this up by the fire and let this cook while I'm working on the other ones. Okay, we got the fire banked up a little bit higher on this spot, and I'm going to place the board. I don't want to get it too close so it catches on fire, but I can feel the heat here. That feels pretty good. Got our little stick here. Prop it up at an angle. And that feels really good. We're going to let that cook. Let's use leaves for our next fire cakes. I'm going to keep watching that one to make sure it doesn't burn. But here's our next fire cake. Let's take out a dough section here. And we're going to make it into a patty. We're not make it as thin as that, but thin-ish. We're going to make it in relationship to the size of our leaves. I've got here some wild grape leaves and some cottonwood leaves. Depending on the time of the year, different leaves are going to work better than other ones, but you want a nice big leaf that's going to protect your fire cake. So let's use a grape leaf on the inside because a little bit of the taste does end up on the fire cake. We're going to put grape leaves on the inside, and then to little extra protection because the leaves are going to slowly burn through. Now we're going to put the cottonwood leaves on, and I've got a really nice coal section here. We're just going to place this right onto the coals. Since it's got the coals right on top and below it, it's not going to take that long to cook. 3, 4, maybe 5 minutes. That's something you're going to judge. You're not going to be able to tell. So it takes a little experience to know when it's ready to come out. The ash bed is really important that you're cooking on. If your ashes are gray, they're probably already too cool to do any cooking on, like these this color. This white hot ash over here, woo, it's really warm. That's the kind of ash we're cooking with, the stuff that's still white. If it's gray, it's gotten too cold to cook with. Our bannock board biscuit looks like it still needs a little bit of time to cook. It's not even... I'll have to turn it over pretty shortly, but this one's probably ready to come out. It's been about 4 minutes or so. I'm just going to lightly scrape off our ashes from the top. And I'm going to scoop the whole patty out. And there it is. Let's put it on top of this board so we can see how it turned out. There we are. Feels like this one's just about done. I could have probably left it in another minute or two, but it's still hot. It's still cooking. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this off to the side where it'll stay warm, but it's still hot, so it's still cooking on the inside. Our bannock board fire cake over here, you can see it's starting to brown up along the bottom side, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate the board so the other side of the top side of it can cook. We want to be real gentle when we turn this over so that we don't knock the bread off. And I'm going to tilt this a little bit further, ouch, so that, because our coals are getting a little cooler, but they're still really warm right there, so it should cook right up. Well, let's try our fire cake where we actually put it directly on the coals. If we don't have good leaves to work with, we can just try cooking our fire cake right on the coals. It's going to char up on the outside, but that's all we have to work with, so let's do it. And we're going to place it right on the coals here. I've got a nice hot section of coals. We're going to place it right on there. I'm going to use my tomahawk because this fire is hot. There we go. And I'm going to find some hot coals close by. And we're going to set them on top. We'll lightly and gently bury it in hot coals. I'm not going to bury it completely. I don't want to lose it in the fire. I want to be able to see around the edges just a little bit so we can watch it cooking. Well, it looks like our bannock board fire cake is ready to pull off. It's browned up all over on the outside, so we're going to go ahead and pull this off the board and put it onto our plate. This may be tough to get off, but this one came off. Now you can see it's still a little damp on that side, cooked completely on that side. I call that done. Well, our bannock bread's off, the other one's out. It smells like our ash cake that's cooking right here in the coals is probably ready to pull out too. So let's pull it out. Look at that. Dust the ashes off the top. We still got some that are sticking to the bottom. Just gently, might still be hot coals, so I'm not going to touch them. A little bit of ash is known to calm your digestive tract, so the ash isn't going to hurt you a bit. And that it looks really good for cooking right there in the coals. So there you have it. You got the 3 different kinds of ash cake or fire cake. We've got our bannock board cake, the one we cooked right in the ashes, and then the one we used the leaves for protection. Let's try these out. Definitely very edible. I think I'll have them for supper tonight. So today we're going to take a common soldier's ration and we're going to turn it into 3 different meals: a soup, a stew, and a hash. The foundation of our stew and our hash, we're going to use salt pork. And the foundation for the stew, we're going to use fresh beef. So the salt pork we're using today is salt pork that we've prepared in an 18th century manner. When it's time to use the salt pork, you have to soak it. You have to take several hours, soak it in water, change the water out, soak it again until it's ready to use. If you don't soak it several times and get all the salt out, it's inedible. So the big difference between a soup and a stew is how much water we use when we prepare it. And the first thing we have to do is to get this water going, get it boiling. I've got 6 pints of water, started boiling here for the soup, and I've got 3 pints for the stew. Let's start out with our soup. While our 6 pints of water is getting ready to boil here, I'm going to brown our salt pork in a little bit of fat. I'm going to let this set and sear a little bit. Browning this meat first will release a lot of the flavors. So we're doing this in small batches. If we do too much at once, we can't get it to caramelize properly. That releases too many juices. Once your salt pork is browned, it's time to dump it in your boiling water. If any scum develops on the surface, scrape that off. We're going to let this boil about 15 minutes. Now that our soup is boiled about 15 minutes with the meat in it, it's time to add some other things. I've got some carrots here and some parsnips. We're going to add those. So there's the carrots, part of our parsnips. From our pocket spice kit, we need to use a little bit of salt and pepper. Oh, yeah, that's looking good. It's also now a good time to add a bay leaf if you've got it. And we've got a little bit of cider vinegar. Just a splash or two of cider vinegar will really set this off. Now that we've added these things to our soup, we're going to moderate the fire a little bit and let it simmer for about an hour. Now that our soup has simmered about an hour, it's time to throw in some cabbage if we've got it. And I've also got a little bit of rosemary and thyme. I got a little bundle here that I'm going to throw in. You don't want to put this stuff in too soon or it'll destroy the flavors. Many period recipes for soup like this will call for bread to be cubed up and tossed in at the end, kind of like dumplings. We're going to let this simmer for another 15 minutes. For this recipe, I've got about a half a pound of dried peas here. We soaked these overnight so they're going to be ready to cook. So I'm starting out with about a half a pound of beef here. This should go really nicely with our peas. Coating this meat with flour and then browning it will help thicken up the stew. So now that our beef is well browned, we're going to add that to our 3 pints of boiling stew water, and then we're going to add our peas. So let's get this beef in there without losing any of it. There we go. And now we're going to add the peas. So now that our stew's boiled for about 15 minutes, we're going to add some potato, some onion, and some parsnips, along with some salt and pepper. We're going to let that simmer for about an hour. You'll know this stew is ready when the peas break down and the stew thickens up, and that really is a matter of how long you've soaked your peas. If you haven't soaked them at all, this might take 2 or 3 hours, but if you soak them, it won't take as long. While our soups and stews are simmering here, let's start the hash. Our hash is a fairly simple dish. I got some finely diced salt pork here. I've already browned this up with some onion. And I'm going to take a couple of parboiled or already boiled potatoes. I'm going to dice these up and mash them, put them in with that. We also need to add a little bit of milk to give it some liquid to work with. If you happen to have some allspice, it makes a wonderful addition to the hash. I'm going to form this up into patties and fry it in our frying pan. Well, there we have all 3 dishes finished. We've got a salt pork soup, and the salt pork really has a wonderful flavor. The saltiness balanced out with the other flavors. Actually, extremely good. Here's our salt pork hash. It may not look great, but let me tell you, it is my favorite on the table here. The salt pork, very tender. Just the right amount of saltiness, along with the potatoes and the onions. Definitely a favorite. So the last dish here was the stew. This is the beef and the peas stew, and it thickened up rather nicely. The peas add their own kind of sweetness to it. The beef is excellent in here. Any one of these things you will definitely enjoy. Today we're going to bake beans. Beans were a common fare in the 18th century, both for regular folks and part of the soldiers' rations. We're going to bake beans in the oven today, and we're going to bake beans buried in a pit. This was common practice in New England for the village baker to heat up his oven, bake his bread and other items, and then at the end of the day, everyone would bring their bean pots and they'd put it in the oven and it would stay in overnight to bake the beans, especially on Saturday night. So on Sunday, everyone had beans to eat and they didn't have to work on the Sabbath. Soldiers didn't have ovens to work with, so they'd have to use whatever they had on hand. We're going to dig a hole so that we can bake our beans inside of a fire pit, down inside the earth. We're looking for a hole in the ground that's about twice as big as the pot we're going to cook in, and a little bit deeper than the pot so we can have coals underneath and on top. So while our oven's heating up, I'm going to go ahead and start a fire in this pit. While our fires are burning down to coals, let's talk about beans. Soaking your beans is a very good idea. It helps them cook for a lot less time. You also should boil your beans. Dry beans have a toxin in them that causes issues with digestion if they aren't heated to the right temperature. So if they're baked at a very low temperature, that doesn't get rid of the toxins, and you need to boil them first. Well, I've had our beans boiling. These have boiled for quite a while. You can boil an hour or whatever it takes to get them nice and soft and ready to bake. We're going to use two different methods of baking, and we're going to flavor these two batches in two different ways. Let's divide our beans up into our two different cooking vessels. We have our new redware bean pot that you can find on our website. We also are going to use one of our 2-quart pots, and we have one of these new metal lids for them that are available that'll be perfect for this sort of operation. Anyway, let's get these divided out. First thing we're going to put into these, they're both going to get some salt pork. You can use authentic style salt pork like we cover in one of our videos. You can also use bacon or salt pork that you find in the grocery store, but they're both rather greasy, fatty, so you would want to cut back on how much you'd use. If you use authentic salt pork, you want to make sure to soak it for an hour or two to reduce the saltiness. Now we're going to put in mustard. Both of these, dry mustard is a very common, you see it in almost every recipe for baked beans. And we're going to need a good big spoonful in each one of these pots. Both our beans recipes use a sweetener. In this one we're going to use a molasses, and this one some maple syrup. Both of those very common sweeteners. We're going to use about a cup. You want to use a Barbados molasses. You don't want to use blackstrap. Barbados molasses or light molasses. It's going to have a lot better taste than blackstrap, which is very bitter. And for the maple beans, you want to make sure to use about a half a cup of authentic maple syrup. And in both pots, a 1/4 teaspoon of pepper here, not one of these spoons, or you'd do too much. So don't go crazy with pepper. And we need some onions in here. We're going to use about half of these, maybe a half a cup or a 1/4 cup of onions. We want to get all the stuff mixed well. Push down to the bottom, mixed well. Let's get both of these stirred up. Now let's top these up with water. Don't be afraid to put too much water in. It's going to boil or it's going to bake off, so you want to have both of these topped off with water. Okay, there we go. Should be enough water. Our fires both places look like they're ready to go. Let's start with our oven baked beans first. Our oven's good and hot. In a previous video, we've shown you how to build one of these ovens and how to fire it and bake bread in it. We actually suggest you go ahead and bake bread in the oven before you put beans in it. You don't want it to be too hot. We're going to let these beans bake. You can bake them in an oven like this for 4 or 6, 8 hours, even 12 hours. the longer the better, and they really start to taste good. You might want to check them after just a couple of hours to make sure there's still some liquid in there. You don't want them baking out too dry. You might need to add a little water. Got to make some room in our fire pit to put this other pot down inside the coals. We're going to make sure you've got coals on all sides, coals on the bottom, hot coals on all the way around each side. Then you want to have a little rock that you can put on top of the lid to make sure it doesn't get knocked off. Now we're going to put coals up on top. We're going to go ahead and build a fire up on top of this so that so it's got more heat. The beans have been in here about 3 or 4 hours, so we're going to go ahead and pull them out now. They could probably cook a lot longer, but let's get these out of here. Well, let's take a look. Whoa, they look really good. These have cooked for about 4 hours, so they're ready to eat right now. If we want them to be even better, we can let them cook longer, another 4 hours or even another 8 hours, and they'll really start to darken up. But these are ready to eat just like this.
These maple beans have been in the embers for several hours. I think they're done. Let's take them out.
There we have our molasses baked beans and our maple flavored baked beans. Both of these we let cook for quite a while. There's a lot of latitude here in how long we're going to bake our beans. They've already been pre-cooked when we put them in. We've already been boiled, so you know they're only going to get softer and better tasting the longer you cook them. We put in the raw salt pork. So you're definitely going to make sure that gets cooked. So you want to bake them at least 2 hours, at the very bare minimum. 4 hours is good, and all the way up to 12 hours. They're only going to get tasting a little bit better. You just need to check on their moisture levels occasionally, make sure they don't get too dry. Another hint on these bean pots, when you're using especially the molasses, they want to boil over, and then this molasses stuff gets stuck between the lid of the pot and the body, and they can be really hard to get off. You don't want to break your pot and break the lid. So you want to either grease the this lid here so that it doesn't get stuck, or you want to make sure to wipe those down when you check on the moisture level. These beans have a flavor that you cannot get anyplace else. I really recommend you try a couple of these bean recipes. They're really good. Good food is really important. The public is going to be more interested in food when you've got really good food and you're cooking. Recruits, if you want people to join your group, really good food is what's going to bring them in. That's a really important part. And you want to have fun when you're reenacting. And probably the most important part of having fun is having really good food. So I encourage everyone to do more period cooking at events. I think you'll really enjoy it. Many of the foods that we've cooked here on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son have been using old recipes that have nearly been lost. While reading through John Mollard's 1801 cookbook, The Art of Cooking Made Easy and Refined, we run into a little bit of a surprise. Something that seems very contemporary and is found on many modern fast food menus. That's the fried onion ring. But this recipe has a little twist. Thanks for watching us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Onions were an important vegetable in the 18th century. We know from period writings that a number of strains of onions were cultivated, ranging from sweet and mild to strong and hot. Onions were harvested in various stages of growth, If the plantings were staggered properly, a family would have onions year-round. But only the stronger tasting onions would have been put into winter storage. Sweet onions had to be consumed shortly after they were harvested. Onions contain sulfur compounds. That's why our eyes become irritated when we chop them. These sulfur compounds are responsible for the onion's flavor, but it also helps preserve the onion. We were a bit surprised to find this recipe for onion rings, and one would expect them to be a simple garnish, but Mollard apparently intended these to be a dish unto themselves. So I've cut these onions into half-inch slices. I'm using Spanish onions today. Now let's get our frying fat ready. This recipe calls for lard. We're using enough for our 5-quart kettle here. This kettle is a good period reproduction, available on our website. Obviously, we've got large pots of very hot oil and an open fire. Need I say more? Be very, very careful. We'll keep an eye on this while it heats up. In the meantime, we'll work on the batter. I've started with 3 eggs that I've beaten really well, and to this, we'll add 5 tablespoons of cream. In addition, a dash of salt and a pinch of pepper.
Next, we'll add about 1/4 cup of flour.
Then we'll add our secret ingredient, 4 ounces of finely grated Parmesan cheese. This is ready to go. Let's cook some up. Our grease is hot. I'm going to dip the rings and then one by one lay them into the hot lard. We'll fry these until they are golden brown on the bottom side. Then we'll carefully flip them and fry them a few minutes more. Be careful, they're hot. These look great and they smell even better. Mollard suggests serving these with mustard in a melted butter sauce, but I'm going to try it just like they come. Those are excellent. Just like onion rings you'd expect, with a wonderful zing of Parmesan cheese. Who would have expected onion rings in the 18th century? We're using the greens that we collected in our last video to make a wonderful springtime soup. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. It's such beautiful springtime weather out right now that I just had to get out of the kitchen, out of the house. You know, it's been a long winter, so we're going to be doing this soup with our springtime greens right out here in a camp setting. Let's get started with our soup. I'm going to put probably 1 quart of water here, maybe a little less. And let's get that started warming up. If you're going to be making your soup with a beef base or some kind of a meat base, especially say you're going to be using a salt ration, then you'll want to put your salt ration in here ahead of time when it's cold. If you're using a fresh beef ration, you want this water boiling when you put it in. For our portable soup that we're going to be using today, actually that goes in last, so we're not going to put the portable soup in yet. For this particular soup, the first thing that goes in is our barley. And let's put in just about a handful of barley here. And regular barley will take approximately an hour in your boiling water before you're ready to put in your other ingredients. You could also put in rice, steel cut groats, or something similar too. Springtime is the perfect time to get out and reconnect with nature and reconnect with your friends and your family in a cooking experience like this, or a spring camping time. It is a perfect time of year for that kind of thing. I really love this time of year because it's so much different than, say, summertime. You get a lot of the plants aren't up yet, but there are no mosquitoes, there's no ticks. We got migratory birds this time of year, so it's a totally different kind of experience. I've got stinging nettles, which is the bulk of what's going on here. And I'm going to chop them up fairly small. The stinging part of these stinging nettles, which is formic acid, goes away in the high temperature of the boiling. So we don't need to concern ourselves, worried about whether that's going to hurt us when we eat it. I've got a little bit of wild garlic. Yeah, I called this wild onions in the last video, but it's actually, with this tubular stem, it's wild garlic. Wild garlic is strong enough that you probably don't want a lot of it in here. I'm just going to use some of the green stems. Chop them up fine. I even have a few of the bulbs that I cleaned off, and we'll just chop those up and put those into. Don't need very much of that. It's gonna bring a lot of flavor in with it. Along with our dandelion greens I've got here, I also have some of the garlic mustard. I'm not going to use a lot of that. You really should pre-taste some of these greens so that you know whether it's going to be something you really want to put a lot of or a little into your soup. If you've got it, carrots, parsnips, many things could go in at this point. So our greens and our barley are done. It's time to put in the portable soup. Here are our little portable soup pieces. And, we're using about a quart of water, maybe a little bit less. We're going to need maybe 3 or 4 pieces this kind of size. And toss it in there. Now, the thing about the portable soup in this recipe is that we don't want to cook this a lot after we put in the portable soup. As soon as the portable soup has dissolved, it's no longer in its little blocks, then your soup is done and it's time to take it off the fire. So I'm going to pay attention to this to make sure that I catch this as soon as it's basically dissolved. It only takes a few minutes, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 minutes for this stuff to break down. I know you're going to ask about a vegetarian version of this same soup. The perfect answer is mushroom ketchup powder. When you get done making your batch of mushroom ketchup, your leftover mushrooms, you let those dry out, and this is a spectacular flavor booster. It's got some salt in it. It's got wonderful flavors, and it's perfect for this. In fact, I think I'm going to cheat and put some in while no one's looking. It definitely is going to need some seasoning, so I've got our pocket spice kit. It's great for a little camping trip like this. Let's go ahead and put in some salt and definitely some pepper. And of course I like pepper, so more the better. And maybe just to give it a little extra zing, how about some cayenne? Also, if you want to thicken this up and you're on the trail, a little bit of ship's biscuit in here would be a great addition. Oh yeah. That's great. And the greens too. This is done. Our soup has cooled down and it looks great. It's really it's even thickened up a little bit. It's still rather warm, but the greens are in there. You can see the barley in there. It's got a nice color to it. Wow. That is excellent soup. There's nothing like cooking your meal out over an open fire like this with greens that you've just gathered, and it's wonderful flavor. Wow. Nice tooth to it. The barley thickens it up nicely. A great flavor from the portable soup. Oh, and that portable soup, we're going to show you in our next episode, next Monday, just how you can make very easily, very simply, this portable soup at home. Today we're doing an episode on soldiers' food, and basically the most simple and primitive soldiers' food, and we'll be concentrating on a couple of pieces right out of Joseph Plum Martin's memoirs. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Well, before we get started, I've got Josh collecting more firewood, and I want to read to you a couple sections out of Joseph Plum Martin's memoirs. Joseph Plum Martin was a Revolutionary War soldier, and after the war he wrote a very detailed memoir that has a lot of description about his food and eating while he was a soldier. Here's that first section. So this is from the campaign of 1776. He says, "We found our invalids consisting of the sick and the lame and the lazy. They had obtained some fresh beef. Where the commissionaires found the beef, or the men found the commissionaires in this time of confusion, I do not know, nor did I stop to ask. They were broiling the meat on small sticks, Indian style, around blazing fires made of dry chestnut rails. The meat, when cooked, was as black as coal on the outside and as raw on the inside as if it had not been near the fire. I asked no questions for conscience sake, but fell to and helped myself to a feast of this raw beef without salt or bread." That's an amazing little piece, amazing little story that he gives us. And you know, that leads me to talking about raw beef. Soldiers' rations were very typically are supposed to be a pound of meat a day. Many times, or most of the times, that was listed as either fresh beef or pork, and they probably meant salt pork at the time. But fresh beef, not salt beef or corned beef or other kinds of beef, but fresh beef. And most of the references that Joseph Plum Martin actually gives in his book about his rations, most of the time the meat he had was fresh beef, although he always complained about it being underweight. It was supposed to be a pound, and he says rarely a pound, and that it was half bones. Well, here's our beef ration today. We've got some nice fresh beef. This looks really good compared to an 18th century beef. He was always complaining that it was very lean, that in fact sometimes it was transparent. But today we're going to cook some of this up. We're going to cut it into little muggets and cook it on the fire with some nice fresh sticks. Josh has prepared these sticks so that we can start getting our meat cooked over the fire. So while Josh is tending to the meat over the fire, let me read you this second excerpt. This is a very interesting piece. I like this. He says, "We drew a day's ration of beef and flour. This was called a pound of each. The flour perhaps was not far from its nominal weight, but the beef was, as it always was in such cases, and indeed in all the others in the army, not more than 3/4 of a pound, and that at best half bone. And how was it cooked?" He says, "Why, as it was usually, as when we had no cooking utensils with us, that is, the flour was laid upon a flat rock and mixed up with cold water, and then daubed upon a flat stone and scorched on one side, while the beef was broiling in the fire on a stick. And this was the common way of cookery when on marches." And we could get anything to cook, that is. And that is the mode that we used at this time. This was the campaign of 1777. So there you have a very, very simple, what's it like when you're on the march and you don't have any cooking utensils and you have to cook up your food. So this may sound familiar to you. We've done ash cakes and fire cakes in a couple of different episodes, but in this one he talks about actually cooking them on a flat stone. So that's what we're going to try today. Well, I took part of our flour ration and I just mixed it with water. I don't have anything else. He wasn't issued anything but just straight flour. So we're just gonna mix it up and make a nice soft paste. And our big rock here is nice and flat. We'll just try cooking it on that. Cakes like this are very challenging on a rock. The rock was very hot, so when I put the flour on it, it kind of stuck right to it. But that gives me the ability to move this rock up into position so that they can get heat on the top side. But you got to be really careful. This rock is extremely hot, and it's very difficult. It's very heavy, so you don't want to hurt yourself if you're trying something like this. Well, here is our cooked up meat. Josh did a great job on the meat pieces, and the bread pieces, well, we'll see how that turns out. They were a little challenging to get off that rock, you could see, but they look good. So let's give this a chance. Let's give it a try.
Oh, I want to try
this is cooked exactly like they would have done that in the 18th century. What do you think about that rock cake?
Nice rock cake.
Yeah, there you go. So the bread, that's a bit challenging, and you really have to, well, hope your rock is clean. You don't get too many bits of
Rock dust.
rock on them. And without any salt, these are very plain.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, if you take them off before they're hard and black like this, they're not bad. I'm going to try out one of these pieces of meat. It looks great. And it's very good. You almost wish you were back there in the 18th century so you could try out some of Joseph Plum Martin's cooked meat over the fire. It could be worse, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah.
This is great stuff.
What you really need to have with this is the fat and the meat that gives a little bit of flavor to the flour, because otherwise the flour's really rough. But together, it's pretty good. You can make it on this.
And you can imagine how much better it would be with salt. He's always complaining that he doesn't have enough salt. He's constantly complaining he doesn't have any sauce, so he probably means vegetables or anything else to go with it.
Like any type of sauce would really help push this up a whole lot, and it's pretty good to begin with.
Right. You can imagine that he didn't have these rations very often. He was very often complaining about not having any food, but when you have it, even if you don't have any utensils and you're on the march, all you've got is your fresh ration. All we had was one knife to sharpen our sticks with.
Yep.
Sometimes you even hear about them using their bayonets.
Yeah.
Even without a knife, you can use a bayonet. Although your officers might get upset about using your bayonet as a cooking device, but
I'm sure they did back then too.
right. So you can use your bayonet to cook your meat on, and nothing but a flat rock, or even if you don't have a rock, you can make the fire cakes. Make sure to check out our other episodes, our Pound of Meat episode, where we talk about rations, and our fire cake episode, where we make the fire cakes right on the coals. It's actually a little easier than doing it on the rock like this, but this is equally a great method. Well, we need to finish this up so we can get back on the march.
Give me another one.
Here you go. That's excellent.
Oh, yeah.
We usually think of fried chicken as, well, traditionally an American dish. But today I'm going to share with you an Old English recipe from 1736 that I think will change the way you make fried chicken. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. The recipe today comes from the little recipe book by Nathan Bailey called Dictionarium Domesticum from 1736. And it's an odd little cookbook. It's set up like a dictionary, so it's in alphabetical order, and this recipe you find under marinade. So that's where we need to start with this recipe, with the marinade. Now this one's actually pretty simple. It starts off with the liquid portion, which is lemon juice and verjus or vinegar. Verjus is actually a very common ingredient you'll find in early 18th century recipes. It comes from the juice of unripe grapes unfermented. And while it's very sour, it actually has a very mild flavor. If you're going to use vinegar, the vinegar that would have been typical in an 18th century, especially English setting, would be malt vinegar. In the time period, they called it wine vinegar, but it's actually malt vinegar today. If you can't find that, or you want to use something that doesn't quite have that kind of a flavor, then you can use cider vinegar or even distilled vinegar. Lemons were available as well, depending on your location and your social position. And interestingly enough, lemon zest or lemon peel was the second most common type of spice you'll find in many of the 18th century cookbooks, so very common. In this case, I'm opting for the juice of 2 large lemons and an equal amount of distilled vinegar. The recipe suggests salt, pepper, cloves, and bay leaf, but no real amounts here, except for the number of bay leaves, 2 bay leaves. So we're guessing maybe a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of black pepper, and a 1/4 teaspoon of cloves. And the last ingredient is something called chiboles. And we had to look that one up. That's spring onions, or as we would call it, green onions. I've got about a 1/2 cup. Shallots are something that you could substitute in this place. Shallots were very common in the 18th century, and it would probably make a very interesting flavor addition. The recipe calls for quartering your chicken. I've actually cut it up into individual pieces so that it'll go a little farther. The recipe suggests marinating this chicken for 3 hours, and you should probably stick to that. If you use some of the more powerful, like the malt vinegar, it can really enhance the flavor too much. So 3 hours is a good time. We're coming up on our 3-hour mark, and it's time to work on the batter portion, and this is a little bit different than what I'm used to. Like our marinade, the batter is also very easy to make. I'm using about 1.5 cups of flour. Just regular all-purpose flour will work fine. And enough white wine, like a Rhenish wine would be good, adding enough to make this into a thin pancake batter. And finally, I'm gonna add the yolks of 3 eggs. You can top this off with a little more wine if you need to get to the right batter consistency. And finally, a teaspoon of salt will finish this off, and mix it so that it's nice and even. If you don't want to use wine, you could use cider instead, or maybe just water. There was no suggestion of the particular kind of oil to fry in the 18th century. They would have used lard probably, or even a clarified butter. You can use the modern oil of your choice. We are deep frying with oil right over an open fire. Obviously, you have to be very careful when you're doing it like this. You want to heat your oil to about 350 degrees. You should see a little shimmer in the top, definitely not smoking. We're going to fry this in batches of 3 or 4 pieces, maybe 5 pieces. Really, it depends on the size of your pot. And I'm not sure exactly how long you want to cook it, but you want to get to the point where the color is a nice light mahogany brown. Now, before we serve this, there's just one more component that we need to do: fried parsley. Now, you may think that's strange, but trust me, you'll love it. Before you fry this parsley, make sure it is very, very dry. Completely dry, blot it as much as possible, or the results can be disastrous. Fry it in small batches for several minutes until it gets nice and crispy. We'll crumble this over the chicken as a tasty garnish. Well, there it is. It looks wonderful. Let's find out just how it tastes. Wow, 18th century fried chicken. And the flavors are definitely a little different than what you're used to. That marinade does something really special. You get a little bit of that lemon flavor comes through, just a little bit, a hint of that, a wonderful flavor, and the crispiness. The fried parsley is really interesting. I really love this recipe. This one is great. Who would have thought 18th century fried chicken? It's great. I love this one, and I think everyone should try it. I want to thank you for coming along as we experiment. We try these really interesting things out, this food from history. I want to thank you for joining me as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm John Townsend, and today we're embarking on a series about baking and roasting in this very versatile utensil here, the Dutch oven. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. There's a very interesting book that was published in the early 19th century. It was published in 1837, but it was actually written in 1832, and it's by Catherine Strickland Parr. It's called The Backwoods of Canada. And she originally wrote this book as a series of letters to her sister talking about life on the frontier in Canada. And it's really amazing. She has a whole section of the book where she talks about Dutch ovens, or she calls them bake kettles. Now, as a regular proper English woman, she probably wouldn't have used something like this in her regular home. But she definitely found they were amazingly useful on the frontier. And let's hear a little bit about what she says about bake kettles. She says, "At first I was inclined to grumble and rebel against the expediency of bake pans or bake kettles. But as cooking stoves, iron stoves, and even brick and clay-built ovens will not start up at your bidding in the bush, these substitutes are valuable and perform a number of uses. I have eaten excellent light bread baked on immigrant hearths in one of these kettles. I have eaten boiled potatoes, baked meats, excellent stews, good soups, and all cooked at different times in this universally useful utensil. So let it not be despised. It is one of those things particularly adapted to the circumstances of settlers in the bush before they have collected those comforts about their homesteads within and without, that are the reward and the slow gleaning up of many years' toil." So you can see how much she loved to use this very versatile tool. And it's one thing to, say, fry in one of these, or bake a soup, cook a soup or a stew in a kettle like this. But it's another thing to learn how to bake and to roast it, where you really have to regulate the temperatures. That's what we'll be focusing on today. Again, it might not seem that easy, but with a little study, we'll get it. So let's look at the anatomy of this Dutch oven for a little bit before we get started warming it up. You can see that it's got a lid. It's a special lid. Dutch ovens, this lid, this idea, the rim on here is specifically so that we can put coals up on top of this and them not fall off. This really is sort of an American invention right there in the late 18th century and early 19th century. It really kind of sets these apart and makes them specifically good for this purpose. So this helps with the specific idea of Dutch oven baking, which is that we want to have heat underneath the cooking pot and we want to have coals up on top to give you heat from both directions. Now, one of the things that'll happen is once you get this idea, you'll think, well, I know, I'll just pile coals up on top of this pot. And that really is the problem. We don't want to have too much on top, or else we'll just overheat this. We'll get too much heat in too rapidly and burn whatever we're cooking. So it really is a balance between getting enough heat below and above, but not too much. That's what we're going to be studying here in just a moment. Another thing we really need to bake in this properly is a good bed of coals. So you have a lot of pre-prepared coals. You can't cook with flaming logs. You really need to have a nice deep bed of coals, and coals you can keep getting from the fire. So if you don't have a good bank of them ready to go, then you might run out just when you needed more. Also, there are environmental factors to take into consideration. Ambient temperature outside really isn't that important that you have to really keep in mind, but wind is. If you've got a lot of wind coming in, it'll hit that pot and take away the heat, and so it can be very difficult to bake. So if you've got a windy situation, you're going to need to protect that Dutch oven baking area from a lot of that wind. You'll need to make some kind of a windbreak. If you go searching online, you'll likely find formulas for baking with Dutch ovens. And the formula usually goes something like this. If you want to get to 350 degrees, you take the inches of your Dutch oven, say a 10-inch Dutch oven, and you put 3 up and 3 down. You take the number of inches, take 10 charcoal briquettes, and for the top you'd put 13 on, and you'd do 7 underneath, so 3 minus and 3 plus. But since we're not using charcoal briquettes, usually in a historic atmosphere like this, we're going to be using hardwood coals. So they aren't the same size as a charcoal briquette, and they usually burn much hotter. So we have to experiment more. We have to use our experience to get the right temperature. So when we're baking in a Dutch oven, we're trying to get the air temperature inside the Dutch oven to oven temperatures, right? 300, 350 degrees. We don't actually usually want to have our actual food right up against the side of the Dutch oven. And so we want to bring our food up off of the floor, away from the walls. So many times we'll use a trivet, something like this. Sometimes we could use little stones and a baking dish, especially if we're baking bread or some kind of pie in our oven. We want to have the pie plate up off the bottom with a trivet, and we want to bake in something like this. Again, we're trying to get the air temperature up to the right. To give you an idea what's happening inside the Dutch oven, we've actually got a modern heat probe in here and a little device, so we can actually read the temperature of the inside of the Dutch oven as we put coals on top and underneath. We can watch, and that will give us an idea about exactly what we're going to do in the future. Let's start off experimenting with just a scoopful of coals down below that we'll spread out, and another scoopful that we will spread on the top of the lid here, and make sure they're all around the edge, not necessarily in the center. There you go. It's only been a minute or two, and just that handful of coals has already raised the temperature 160 degrees and still going higher. Okay, our temperature seemed to level off at about 200 degrees, so let's put another scoopful, a light scoopful, on the lid and see what happens. So it's been 10 minutes, so we've had just 1 scoop at the bottom, 2 scoops on top. Our temperature is already to 260 degrees, so you can see it really doesn't take too long to get it up to almost baking temperatures. Obviously, we'll need a little bit more to get it to where we would want to bake bread or something. You have to really be careful about taking the lid off and checking your baking a lot. If you do that, you'll extend the baking period a great deal, because the temperature will go down inside the oven a lot. Well, we're just about to 350 degrees in the internal temperature here. We've got 2 scoops of hardwood coals underneath and 3 scoops up on the lid. And this is a 12-inch Dutch oven. If you're working with a smaller Dutch oven, obviously, you'll need fewer coals, and a bigger one, obviously more coals. And as these coals die down, they'll need to be replenished. So you can see you have to be watching this all the time. And the more you bake like this, the easier it will become. So there's a lot of heat, not only going down from the lid of this, but coming up off of the lid. And one of the beauties of Dutch ovens is you can stack them up to conserve your coals, so that this set of coals on this lid will actually be the bottom coals for another Dutch oven that's up on top. So we preheated this oven. It's well up into temperature. In fact, what we'd like to do is go ahead and bake bread while this is hot. Now, bread needs to be really hot, 450, 425 degrees. So we put an extra scoop down below and an extra scoop on top. Now with this 12-inch Dutch oven, it's completely level on top, and it should be about up to temperature. And I've got some dough that's already ready to go in the oven. This is risen, so let's get it in the oven and get it baking. Well, here's the bread. It's not right out of the oven because I let it cool down. It's still really, really warm. The problem with baking bread at an event is you really need to let it totally cool off, maybe even all night long until the next day, for the crumb to set up. Now I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna rip this bread open. We're gonna have some right away. It smells wonderful. It's still steaming inside. The crumb had set up enough, so it should be perfect. Bread right out of the oven. Wow. This bread was really was not so difficult at all in the Dutch oven. You have to pay attention to it. You have to have a little experience, and you have to do some. You probably have to fail on 3 or 4 loaves before you get it. This one probably could use just a little bit more heat underneath. But again, I mean, we're still learning, and it is so simple. And you can do it at an event without great quantities of equipment. Just a simple Dutch oven. Bread is so wonderful when you can bake it at an event. I'm telling you, everybody will love you. I want to thank you for coming along as we continue to experiment and have these experiences with this food as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm John Townsend. We're continuing our series in Dutch oven cooking, and in this episode, we'll be baking a roast. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. In 1837, Catherine Strickland Parr wrote a little book called The Backwoods of Canada. And in this book, she's giving advice to folks that are going out into the frontier of Canada. And she has some amazing advice about not shunning this particular cooking device. And she calls it a bake kettle. And today we call them Dutch ovens. She talks about how highly versatile they are, that you can bake breads, you can cook meats in them and roast in them, all these different things. Today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to roast beef in a Dutch oven. So today's recipe comes from the little cookbook called Domestic Economy. It's 1794, and it's Maximilian Hazelmore. And this recipe is called rump au ragout. Basically, we know it as pot roast. So the ingredients we're using today really haven't changed. It's basically just like a pot roast you would do today. I've got a 2.5 pound rump roast, and we've got carrots and onions. Let's put this together. Let's season this with salt and pepper on all the different sides. Now, dredge this in a little bit of flour. Okay, this looks good. Let's brown it in the pan. Okay, let's get this pan nice and hot to brown this. This is already probably pretty much up to temperature. Let's toss in some of our butter here. Yeah, it's hot. And here goes the meat. You want to simmer this until it's nicely browned on all sides. That side looks good. Now that our meat is browned on all sides, I can remove it from the pan and deglaze the pan. And I'm doing this with cider. The original recipe actually calls for the use of small beer, but of course you really can't find that today, so cider is going to work fine for this. I'm using maybe a cup or two here and just scraping all the gunk off the bottom of the pan. Now the meat goes back into the pan, and we will place around that some onions. I've just half sliced these onions. There's 3 or 4 here, and 3 or 4 carrots cut up, not too small. Now we can put in this special little onion. You see this onion here. It's an onion that's got cloves in it. This is very, very common in 18th and 19th century recipes. And we'll just toss this in right up on top. And now in go some herbs. I've got thyme and rosemary. We'll put those right up on top. Next comes beef broth. I'm going to pour this until it's maybe 2/3 the way up the side of the roast or so. That looks good. Now we can put the lid back on, and we're not going to put it back on the fire, but we're going to put it on a very regulated, a very controlled area. We want this to just bake at, say, 300 to maybe 350 degrees tops. So we don't want to just set it on the fire. It would cook too quickly. We want this to take 3 hours to cook. Now it's time to get this cooking area ready to bake. I'm going to put a layer of coals down first. This is a little more than I would normally put down because this ground is wet. But these will probably die off pretty rapidly, and we're going to have to come back and check. Now that that's in, let's lay the oven on top of those. And now I'm going to put in a layer of coals on top of the lid. Now, it's just a little bit, right around the outside edge. We don't want to just heap this up. It'll get way too hot. Now, let's keep watching this. Every 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to come back and check this oven to make sure that we haven't gotten too cold or that we're not too hot. And make sure to take this off and check the lower bed to make sure they haven't died out. Remember, not too much at the bottom. So every 10 or 15 minutes when we check underneath, we also want to rotate the pot as it goes. So we're going to rotate the Dutch oven 90 degrees, and we're going to rotate the lid 90 degrees to keep that heat even as possible. Now let's check underneath this oven and look. Oh yes, these lower coals are way too cool now. I need to put a few more coals down underneath to keep that heat going, and I'm going to check the top. This still feels really good, so I don't need to add any top coals just yet. Our beef has been in the Dutch oven for well over 3 hours, and it's very done. So I'm going to remove all the contents of the Dutch oven here, the gravy, the meat, and the vegetables. And now in this empty pan, I'm going to put in a little butter and a little flour. We're going to make a roux and brown this butter and flour up. And now we can return the gravy back in there so we get a nice thick sauce. And after our gravy is thickened, in go the mushrooms, about a half a pound of mushrooms sliced in half. Well, it smells terrific. It smelled terrific the whole time while we were waiting for it to be done. It looks wonderful. Mushroom ketchup is one of those things that we could have even put into the gravy. I'm going to put a little bit up on top because I know that'll add just a little bit that I really love. There we go. And now let's give it a try. The meat was done to perfection. Nice and tender. And all the vegetables are nice and tender too, but not mushy. And that mushroom ketchup goes perfectly with this kind of a dish. This is wonderful and simple. It takes time to cook, but really such a wonderful dish for a large setting, a great family dish. Wonderful. This came right out of the Dutch oven. Do not be afraid to try using the Dutch oven for dishes like this. Very simple and works perfectly. I want to thank you for coming along as we continue to try these things out, as we continue to savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Dutch ovens were extremely versatile, and that's one of the reasons why they were so popular in 18th and 19th century North America. Today we're doing a savory beef steak pie. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. This recipe comes from Amelia Simmons' 1796 cookbook, American Cookery. If you haven't watched our earlier Dutch oven cookery series explaining getting these ovens up to heat, I would encourage you to do so. I'm setting my 12-inch Dutch oven over a bed of coals and putting a few coals on top to preheat it so that it's ready to go when we're ready to put this pie in. To prepare this pie, I'm using a 9-inch redware pie plate. These are the pie plates that our master potter Gary Nieder makes. They're wonderful pie plates. You can find them on our website or in our print catalog. I'm lining the outside of the pie plate here with puff paste. And this is a real typical instruction you'll get in 18th century cookbooks, to just line the outside with puff paste. You can use either puff paste that you buy at the store. You can find it in the frozen food section, or there's a video that we do on making your own puff paste. I'll make sure to put a link down in the description section for that. I'm starting by placing a tablespoon and a half of butter in the bottom of my pie pan. In this recipe, we'll end up using about 1/4 pound of butter, so be prepared for that. I've taken a 2-pound shoulder roast and I've sliced it into about 1/2 inch thick slices. And now I'm going to start to layer that in. So first, we put in a layer of our steak. This is a really nice cut. I've already trimmed all the gristle out. I'll follow this with a little bit of salt and pepper, and then I'll sprinkle a nice bit of flour on top of that. We want a good little layer here. This is going to make a great gravy. Next, I've got some nice big slices of white onion, and I'll top off this layer with another tablespoon of butter. Now we're going to repeat this again. Again, we're gonna put down a steak, a layer of steak, nice and thin. We don't want it to double up here. And again, we put on the salt and the pepper and the flour, and then the onions again. And after the onions, butter again. You should be able to get about 3 layers in your pie. Now that our pie has got all the layers built together, now it's time to put in some liquid. And we can use a couple of different liquids. We could use water, we could use hard cider, or a small beer or a light beer if you've got that. Anything is going to make a good liquid for our pie. I'm going to pour in some of the liquid right now before I put the top on around the edges, because it can be hard to get all the liquid into the pie that we want to get. Now it's time to put on our puff paste top. And here's our puff paste that we're going to put on the top of our pie. And we'll put this on and pinch it down. You definitely want a good seal between the body of the pie crust and this top layer, this lid that we're gonna put on. So make sure to wet the edge if the top isn't gonna seal well. Now make sure to pinch this lid down nice and tight. Then we're gonna cut a little hole in the top and then pour in another tablespoon or 2 of our liquid on top of that. And then we're ready to bake. The pie is ready to go into the oven, and of course, I've already preheated this oven, so it should be close to temperature. I don't need to worry about that. Let's go ahead and remove the lid and place this pie in here gently, and let's close this up. This needs to cook rather slowly at a low temperature. We don't want to overheat this, so maybe 300 degrees is what we're shooting for. We talked about trying to keep a lower heat in that earlier episode this series. In this case, we want maybe a scoop and a half around the bottom edge of this Dutch oven. So make sure to refresh your coals after you've preheated, and maybe 2 scoops on top, 2.5 scoops max. We don't want to overdo this, or else our meat will be tough if we cook this at too high a temperature. And from an earlier episode, we want to make sure to remember that we need to continue to rotate this oven 90 degrees every 15 or 20 minutes. And we keep picking up it and rotating it around, and rotate the lid separately. You want to keep rotating the lid. The problem, especially in this case where we've got the fire pit off to the side, it's going to be hotter on one side than the other. So that's why we want to keep rotating. And our coals might be hotter on one spot than the other. We don't want to overcook one spot over another, so we keep rotating the lid and the body around a little separately. Someone asked in an earlier episode about the tools I was using, and really, I only need a couple real good tools for Dutch oven cooking. You can do without some of these, but you really need a couple of them to do it well and to do it easily, let's just say that. Mainly, we're definitely going to need a Dutch oven. We sell a couple different sizes of those. A trivet is probably the next most important piece. A nice triangular trivet. If you don't want to have a trivet like this, you can just use a couple of stones that are the same size, 3 or 4 stones, or even an S-hook thrown in the bottom here. A couple S-hooks will do the same job, but the trivet does a really good job. I like to use a real trivet when possible. A pie pan. These pie pans are great, and we use them so many times. If you want to keep things up off the bottom, you're going to need to cook on top of that trivet with something like a pie plate. Also, a pair of these little ember tongs, excellent for doing individual pieces. Sometimes you want to get pretty precise. The ember tongs help you pick those up and do some precise work. The Dutch oven lid lifter is a killer tool that really makes it much easier to get the lid off of these without them falling over. I mean, you can just use a hook, but the lid can tilt and all your ashes can drop right into the Dutch oven, which ruins it. The Dutch oven lid lifter helps you lift that up, and with these extra prongs, balance it so it stays level. So it's a really handy tool, and you can just use the hook to pick up the whole Dutch oven and rotate it. You really need that kind of tool. Also, you're going to need some kind of a shovel, and you really don't need a big shovel. These little hearth shovels that we have in the catalog are perfect. They pick up just the right amount of coals, and they're nice and small, and they don't have a handle that can burn up. So they're really handy for working with these Dutch ovens.
And the last tool I really suggest is a pair of leather gloves. We don't have these in the catalog. You can get a pair of welding gloves. Look for something that's not looking too modern. You don't want blue ones. So if you can find a nice pair of brown welding gloves, these make it so much easier to get those pie pans out of there, or to just lift up the oven or the lid at times when you don't want to burn yourself, obviously. So these are really helpful to have. There are some other tools that we don't carry that can make it easier, like sometimes there's a special tool to lift pie plates up out of the Dutch oven. Boy, that's a lot of bother to carry too many tools. This is probably enough for just about anybody. Wow, this looks tremendous. It is ready to go. You know, this reminds me of the beef pasty we did a number of years ago. So we definitely need to let this guy rest. It can even be eaten cold, and the colder we let this get, probably the more it's gonna come out in one piece. I can't wait that long, so let's cut into this so we can try it out. Okay, this really smells good, and it's time to try it out. I really want to put some mushroom ketchup on it right away, but I'm gonna wait because I want to see what this really tastes like before I put the wonderful mushroom ketchup on it. That's a tremendous mix of flavors. Excellent. The beef, perfectly tender, wonderful. Puff paste, you can't go wrong. And that onion flavor in there, along with the spices. And I did not put too much pepper. Don't worry, you can always put a little bit more on, but it's a perfect medley of flavors. Amazing. Now let's try it with the mushroom ketchup. I know this is really going to set it off. Wow. That little bit of kind of vinegar taste and the extra salt and the mushroom flavor, to die for. I think I wanted, instead of the water, I should have just dumped mushroom ketchup in right on top before I cooked it. This would be a tremendous thing to cook at an event. Everyone will love you, so you should try this one out. The flavors are tremendous. It's not difficult to do. There aren't even that many ingredients. So definitely try this one out. I want to thank you for coming along as we try these things out, as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Curds aren't something you find in recipe books today, at least very often, but in the 18th century, it was a common ingredient. In this episode, we're doing a wonderful curd fritter. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. This recipe is from Eliza Smith's Complete Housewife from 1758. Very interesting recipe. The first thing we really need here are curds. And what we're going to do today is to make curds for this recipe. You may be able to find curds in the grocery store today. They're definitely becoming a more popular item. If you can't find them in the store, they're very easy to make. In order to make curds, we need rennet. Rennet is an enzyme that's found in the lining of calves' stomachs, and it's there to make it so that the milk that comes in curdles immediately, and it's to make it digestible for the calf. Today we're using animal rennet that we purchased online. And in the 18th century, they would have used something that was essentially the same thing. They would have had a calf's stomach that they would have dried, they would have sliced that into tiny pieces, and they would use a tiny little piece to put into their milk to curdle it. But really, what's happening here is almost exactly the same thing. The recipe calls for a handful of curds. We've got about a half a gallon here. This should yield approximately 8 ounces of curds. I'm guessing that's a handful. I've put the milk down here by the fire. I want to get it to blood warm, just under 100 degrees. So I don't want to put it over the fire. I don't want to risk cooking it, heating it up too much. Just by the fire. Make sure to stir this while you're heating it up slowly. And if you're doing it by the fire like I am, make sure to cover it so you don't get too many ashes in the milk. So it doesn't really matter what kind of milk you use, either 2% or whole milk, but it does matter whether it's ultra pasteurized or not. You can use standard pasteurized, homogenized milk for this, but if it's ultra pasteurized, it's just not gonna work. The temperature is perfect. It's taken a little while, but let's get this over and put the rennet in it. The rennet procedure is pretty simple, but we have to do it right. We need approximately a half a teaspoon for this amount of milk of the liquid rennet. I'm stirring this into 1/4 cup of non-chlorinated water. Now let's add this to our milk, but we can't just dump this in. We need to slowly drizzle it around so that it gets in here very evenly, just a little bit at a time. And now I'm gonna give it one very gentle stir. And now I'm gonna set this aside, the spoon aside. Maybe I'm gonna cover this up and let it rest for 15 or 20 minutes for this curd to set up. It's been 20 minutes. It's time to check the curd to see if it's ready to work with. The way to test the curds to see if it's ready is to stick your finger or a knife in, sort of like this, tilt the blade up, and if you see that the curd breaks cleanly, it's ready. Now we need to cut the curd, and we cut the curd so that it can release its whey. We cut it in a crisscross pattern all the way to the bottom, about a 3/4 inch wide strips, one way and then another. And now I'm gonna come in and actually cut it at an angle, 45 degrees away from my grid and 45 degrees at an angle in, again, to help release that whey. And we'll do this in the opposite direction just one more time. Now we're going to let this set another 20 minutes to a half hour so that it can continue to release the whey completely. Well, after half an hour, you can definitely see that the whey is separated from the curd. Once the whey is separated, you're gonna wanna put this back by the fire for a good 20 minutes, trying to bring this up to a temperature of, say, 110 degrees or so. This will help it separate out a little bit better. Line a sieve with cheesecloth. Now we can pour our curds in. Once I have this tied up, I can hang it so that it can drain completely. Okay, so we had difficulties with the curd here at the campfire, at the campsite. You really need to keep these up to the right kind of temperature or they're not gonna separate, right? So we had to fight our curds. So the curds are ready. Now it's time to make the batter. We have a handful of flour. To that, we're gonna add our spices. We've got some nutmeg here, maybe 1/4 of a nutmeg, some mace, maybe a half a teaspoon, and 1/4 teaspoon of clove. They kind of go together as a threesome in many of these recipes. And now 2 teaspoons of sugar. We probably don't need a lot here because some of that's gonna go on the top as they come out after they're done cooking. I'm gonna set these dry ingredients aside for just a second and let's bring on our eggs. The recipe calls for 10 eggs. Now, 18th century eggs might have been a little bit smaller, so you might not need so many if you're using regular large eggs from the grocery store, maybe 8. I've got 10 eggs here. I'm gonna whisk these up, put them in the big bowl, and now I'm gonna sift in the dry ingredients to try to get this all mixed in nice, right? Okay, that's looking good. Let's put the curds in. I'm gonna break these up with my fingers and put them in the mix and stir it in with the spoon. If it's a little thin, well, you can bring in a little bit more flour. Again, they didn't have exact measurements here. You know, a handful of flour, a handful of curds. You really just have to make your way through this, get it to the right consistency that you feel is gonna work. It should be a thick batter.
And now for a little sugar on top.
Well, here they are. They look really interesting, and I could tell by the way they went in that they definitely looked interesting in that how they were going to turn out. And you can see from this shot internally, they're very eggy, and not like say an elephant ear that you might be used to. Let's find out what they taste like. Hey, oh, I love the nutmeg in there. I think the cheese is just in there for a texture. And the cheese doesn't bring a lot of, kind of a cheesy flavor with it because it doesn't have a lot of salt in it. But you get some of the wonderful egginess. You get the wonderful spices that were in there. And it definitely needed a good bit of sugar up on top because we didn't have a lot in the batter. You might want to put a little bit more sugar in the batter than we did to sweeten it up just a bit more. That way you didn't have to put maybe so much sugar on the outside. A great dish to try out. These fritters are, you've never had anything like them. I can tell you that right now. You know, we struggled with this one, but it still turned out great. I want to thank you for coming along as we experiment, as we try out these things. We never know how they're going to turn out. I love it when we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Hi, I'm John Townsend, and I want to invite you to this very special series of videos. We're here at Mount Vernon, the home of General George and Martha Washington, right here in Northern Virginia. I'm right here on the beautiful Potomac River. We have this amazing house behind us and all these wonderful historic buildings, and we'll be exploring some foods that likely would have been eaten here and on the grounds at different places. This is going to be so much fun. I really want to invite you to come along and experience this. Come on.
Hello, Deb. You are Deb Colburn. And what's your title?
I'm the interpretive program supervisor for historic trades, John.
For historic trades. This is wonderful. We're going to be doing a lot of cooking this weekend, right?
We sure are.
Or this week. But not as much cooking as would normally go on here.
That's correct.
Tell me about this.
Absolutely. So in Washington's lifetime here at Mount Vernon, this is fishing season. So this is when 1 million to 1.5 million shad herring are being harvested out of the river every spring during a 6-week period. And that is a time when Washington is calling for all hands on deck, literally bringing slaves out of their regular duties, not just field hands, but his blacksmiths, his carpenters, his spinners, his dairymaids, his house servants. And so as a result, they're working round the clock while the fish are running. Washington wants those nets out there. These people are not going to be going back to their homes to prepare their meals for themselves the way they normally do. The cookeries at the fisheries are going to be providing these non-stop, constant, cycle around the clock meals for the slaves on a large scale because of how many mouths there were to feed.
And there are multiple fisheries right here in the location.
There were 9 miles of coastline here at Mount Vernon. Washington has. So he's got 3 different fisheries on each poignant part of the coastline, located at 3 different farms.
And how many, you said, how many fish was that again?
1 million to 1.5 million.
And these are big fish.
Shad herring. This is a shad herring.
How much is it going to weigh?
I think this one in particular was about a 20-pounder.
I can't, that is hard to fathom. And this is all hand processed fish at the time, and they're doing this within a 6-week period.
6-week period. Now the salting is happening at the same time as well. So not just the fresh fish is being prepared, but the main purpose for these fisheries is Washington's export business of salt fish herring down to the West Indies, and to produce enough salt fish to give each of his working slaves 5 ounces of salt fish every day, 365 days out of the year.
It's an incredible process. I'm sure it must have been amazing to watch it going on.
Well, we can only imagine, and the documentation that we have, of course, can bring up vivid imagery of what was going on.
Wow. So how do we get started with this guy?
Okay, well first we have to clean him. And so what that entails basically is scaling him. So removing any of the scales that will come off with the scraping of the knife. Now they're silvery, and what's fun about these fish is that they were incredibly visible, not just because of their quantity in the river, but the amount of
They're so brilliant.
yeah, just brilliant and shining in the sunlight. So here we go. So basically taking off the majority of the excess scales and then moving from the scaling into cutting its head off.
Okay. We don't need that.
Nope, we don't need the head. Although they probably were saving this to put in soups, fish head soup. I would have been able to get some nutrients out of that. And one more
Maybe
thing
we'll do that
to
some
feed.
other day.
Other day. I'm not as interested in it myself. He's a big one, so just keep working our way through here.
Without cutting yourself. Good.
And then we're gonna get rid of all the stuff on the inside that we don't need. Focus on
The actual meat
the
portion.
actual meat portion. And so then the next thing that happens is you have to cut through so that you can splay it open like I've done with this one here.
Right.
And that's, it's called butterflying it,
Basically separating the ribs from the spine.
in order to get one whole side to lay flat. There we go. All right. That's a much happier one. Now I'm just gonna dip her into my wash tub
Okay.
so that I can get the last of the mess off. Now we're gonna season them.
Okay, seasoning.
Seasoning. So the kinds of things that would have been very readily accessible are gonna be cayenne pepper.
Okay.
Lots of different hot, spicy peppers according to our records here at Mount
Really?
Vernon that Washington is growing. He's experimenting with all different kinds, fish peppers, bird peppers, cayenne.
That's amazing.
Isn't it incredible?
I really wouldn't have guessed that.
So those do well by them. They've also got black peppers, and the other seasoning that I'm going to use today is, oh, I didn't want to neglect my other one that's not quite so pretty, but still going to taste just fine. I've also have some salt and some rosemary and dried thyme. Now they're using Portuguese salt.
That's interesting.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Now, so Washington is choosing Portuguese salt because it's best for the salting of the fish that he needs to ship and to preserve for long periods of time. And that's his preferred. He's always complaining about when he has difficulty getting it and looking for it. And we are, it seems to me and to the majority of the historians here that the salt that they're going to be using for cooking with is probably the same salt they're salting with at the fisheries anyway. Because you got barrels and barrels of it.
Why would you use something else?
Right, exactly. And again, this is just dried rosemary, some thyme, some of your more traditional savory spices. So at this point, this is your planked or ready to plank shad.
Okay.
And we'll be attaching it to the plank with nails and basically nailing it into the plank from the top.
Okay.
And that way the fire will be able to roast the inner meaty portion of the fish. Yeah.
So this is our planking station, right?
That's right.
Where we can build a fire, but right now we don't have a fire. We're just gonna, how do we do this?
Well, we're gonna mount the fish on the plank.
Okay.
So what I'm gonna need you to do is hold it in place for me about there.
Okay.
While I get my nails. And it's super simple. You just basically push it right through the flesh, but up in a nice strong area that's gonna hold the whole weight of the fish. That's one.
Okay. And it doesn't get any nails or anything down here?
Nope, it's just gonna dangle free.
It's just gonna dangle.
Dangle free.
Okay.
All right, we got that one there, beautiful. And so you can imagine on a really big scale operation how large this plank wall would be and how many fish you're gonna be attaching to it regularly. And basically once you get your nails in place, you can just slide the fish off later on and slide the fish right back over the same nails. So you're not having to re-nail every single time.
So
I think that's going to do it.
and that there they are.
There they are. Now we build our fire in front.
And we'll just have a low fire right there.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Deborah, these have been on for
About an hour.
about an hour. How do you know when they're done, other
Well-
than maybe by looks?
Well, by looks, but also traditionally, you know, just like you do anything else you're checking at your oven at home, you're going
Right.
to poke them. You're going to feel what that flesh feels like. You're going
Right.
to take a peek on the inside, and I see nice cooked fish there.
Right. So it's like flaky, it's white, it's not that red translucent color.
Exactly.
Okay, and so, and you haven't turned this or anything. It's
Nope.
just, there it is.
There it is,
Okay.
roasted right off, in front of the open fire.
And how do we get it off of there?
We're going to slide it right off of these handy dandy nails.
And not drop it in the fire.
And not drop it in the fire or catch that tail on
and
fire.
it holds together really well,
Doesn't
maybe with
it?
all that fish skin and everything.
Yep, but look how flaky it wants to peel
That
off
is, that
already.
looks amazing. There's the fish. You've separated some of it out for us. Obviously, we've got some bone issues we have to deal with, right? You've got
Yes.
two different kinds of like these big, easy to see bones
Yes.
that seem to be fairly easy to separate. And then along this back edge, these little hair-like bones.
They're very, very tiny, but they actually, basically you could even chew them up and digest them. We don't
Yeah.
like to, so I try to
so we separate
remove them out as
but they're
much
not
as
terrible.
possible.
They're not
No,
terribly difficult.
No.
Okay. Well, I'm ready to give it a try. It looks good. It smells good.
See what you think.
It's got a wonderful texture. It's not too soft, not too hard. It's not a difficult. You know, you would think it might be easy to overcook this and make it. You'd ruin it, but I mean, it's like a plank by the fire. You did a perfect job
Thank you, John.
getting this off before when it was supposed to, or maybe it. I mean, is it easy?
I think that basically fish cooks itself as long as you put heat in front of it.
There we go.
It's just not letting it go too long.
Okay.
And being sure that unless you know, are of a sushi generation, that it's not too undercooked. And
Right.
so basically though, that just comes with experience. You start to tell what, as you mentioned before, what it looks like, whether
Yeah.
it's too translucent
The right
or not.
texture,
The right
yeah,
texture,
yeah.
absolutely right.
Right. And it's got a wonderful smoky flavor to it. It's got the amazing spices that you put on there.
It's one of my favorite things to cook this time of year because I love imagining what it must have been like to lay out a whole table worth of these planked fish
Right.
and having everybody together in a
Yeah.
very unusual setting, just diving in and getting sustenance and enjoying the first fresh catch of the season. It's just not a usual activity here at Mount Vernon except during fishing season.
Right. And it was an all you could eat probably situation. As much as you want, we've got all, just go out and catch some more.
That's right, that's right.
Well, amazing flavors. What do you think for the flavors? What would you?
I'm very happy. Sometimes I leave off the cayenne and I go more with a rosemary, thyme, heavy, you know,
Right.
in that savory direction. But I like it both ways.
It is really, really wonderful. Thank you for bringing this one to us, showing us all of this really, really interesting information.
Well, thank you, John, for coming here and letting us host you and be a part of it.
I want to thank everyone out there for coming along with us as we experiment with this. This is an amazing site. If you're ever in this Northern Virginia area, George Washington's Mount Vernon, this living history site with the mansions and the buildings and the people doing things and the historic trades. There is so much to see, so much to learn. It is truly an amazing site. It is a gem. You have to come here. I want to thank you for coming along with us and experiencing in any way you can, savoring along with us the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Welcome. I'm John Townsend, and we're doing another special episode here at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Such a tremendous place, and this is another in a series that we're doing. If you haven't seen the earlier ones, go back and watch them. They'll help give you context for this episode. We're going to be making something special again with Deb Colburn. Come along as we experience this dish. It's going to be good.
Hello, Deborah. I hope I'm not late.
No, John,
Okay.
not at all.
We've done fish, 3 different episodes of fish. Fish sounds like it was just amazingly important to what was going on
Here at Mount Vernon,
right.
absolutely, it really was. It was not only a major staple for the population, both enslaved, hired, and the Washingtons themselves, but it was one of his major export businesses. So it's
Right.
where the money's coming from a lot of the time.
Right. So what are we doing today, though?
Today, we're going to be working with another vitally important ingredient in our recipe. We're making fried hoe cakes, which are cornmeal pancakes.
Okay.
And that is Washington's second most important crop at Mount Vernon
Okay.
after his cash crop wheat. Because corn, and this is white cornmeal ground at the grist mill here, corn was being fed to the enslaved population as a major ration. Each working hand is getting an entire quart of cornmeal daily.
So it's like their bread
365
ration.
days out
That's
of the
their-
year.
yeah.
Absolutely right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. And so we're starting with the white cornmeal and water and a little cayenne pepper, because we already talked about how much that is plentiful, and it's something we know that they had a taste for, and it's going to kind of liven up those hoe cakes. You know,
Sure.
you can do it without, but why do it without when you can add the spice, right?
Okay, sure. So hoe cakes were probably one of the simplest things they were normally cooking, right?
Absolutely, especially for the slaves. There are more elaborate recipes using cornmeal and to make hoe cakes for, say, the Washington's table, but for the
Okay.
slaves, you're looking at simply adding your meal,
Okay.
your water, and your spices, and you're just going to get it to a pancake batter consistency. So I'm going to start with probably the equivalent of about 5 cups or so of
But it's all just a
cornmeal.
ratio anyway,
But it's a
right?
ratio. I mean, I'll be honest, other than weighing things from time to time, it's rare that I measure. I just
Right.
kind of go by feel.
Sure.
So I'm going to add to the cornmeal a little bit of that spice we talked about, that cayenne pepper, spice them up a little bit, and a little bit of salt. Get that all mixed in. And then we just add water. Now this is warm water.
Yeah.
And you know, so basically any water that they would have been able to warm up by their fire before they added it in. The warm water helps the cornmeal to rise up a little bit in the skillet. But once we get this into a pancake consistency,
So you want it pretty thin.
yeah, it's going to be ready to put in the skillet. And so this would have been a wonderful thing for the slaves to prepare for themselves, quick and easy, first thing in the morning in the dark, because they're supposed to be in the fields by sunrise or any of their other occupational locations, depending on what they were doing for the Washingtons. And you know, there's some conceptions that, and they're misconceptions, that hoe cakes were cooked on hoes out in fields. That's not where they get that that term. There were griddles that resembled hoes.
Okay.
And so that's where that terminology is
Sure.
coming from. But you know, you wouldn't want an
No.
open fire in your field.
I don't think so.
No,
I don't think
no
so.
gentleman farmer would condone that, and Washington certainly wouldn't have. So that's pretty much.
There we go. Nice thin batter.
Look at that. Ready for the skillet.
Okay. So,
Okay, we're going to start with our lard. Now that we've got our preheated skillet and our hot cooking coals underneath. All right, now you can pretty much just ladle in
okay.
about the amount that you would use. So just like pancakes, they've got to sizzle up on the bottom and start to bubble a bit on top before we want to flip them.
So these guys are ready?
Yep.
You flipped them over and they look good.
They do. So now we're going to go ahead and take them on out
Okay.
into our bowl. Hoe cakes.
Okay.
Cornmeal pancakes.
Let's take them to the table.
Sounds like a plan.
These hoe cakes, they look special. I don't know if I've ever had hoe cakes with pepper in them before.
Okay, so it's because it's a corn. Think of a southwestern tradition, same kind of
sure.
idea,
Okay.
except here being brought up by the enslaved population from West Indies exposure,
Right.
and of course Washington's growing them too. But try one.
Okay,
Now,
okay.
They are not meant to stand on their own.
Right.
You know,
They're
you'd be eating
accompaniment.
them with something else. So be kind.
No. Bread is, you know, bread can be very, very plain. And we eat it all the time. We like it. It's wonderful. This is like a bread, right? Mm-hmm. So it's meant to go with other things. We could probably put stuff on it if we wanted to.
We could. You could have it with a soup or a stew.
Have it with the soup or the stew as an accompaniment, as a change in texture. They taste great. There's almost no ingredients here.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
I mean, you stir some water in and you got a little bit of seasoning and that's it. And salt, right?
And salt.
That's
yeah.
it.
Yep, that's it.
The flavor is wonderful.
Well, I'm glad that you
The
like it.
texture is great.
And now it's a little deceiving because we call them hoe cakes, and we kind of liken them to pancakes, but they're not light and airy like pancakes. They're denser like bread, as you pointed out.
There's no real leavening other than what the ground things kind of bring along with them, which is fine. This is such an important part of what's going on in the diet in the 18th century, and it connects with these other things going on in other cultures too. You know, oat cakes that are happening with the Scots, and you know, but we take those traditions and we come to America and we've got corn.
Yep.
And what are we going to make? Well, the same thing, corn cakes.
That's right.
So they're wonderful. Thank you for telling us all about this and making them for us. And they taste so wonderful, and they're so fun to watch and experiment and understand just how simple they are. And that anyone can do them. At home, you can make these.
Absolutely.
So simple.
So simple, John.
So wonderful. I want to thank everyone, and I specifically want to thank Deborah here and all the folks at Mount Vernon. They have just been so kind and so welcoming to us. And, you know, it's so exciting to connect with these different historic sites, Mount Vernon especially. If you're ever in this area, Northern Virginia, this is a tremendous resource, a national resource. We need to be using this. We need to be understanding it. We need to be experiencing it. I call you to do that whenever you have the opportunity and to tell other people. And I want to thank you for coming along on this video, experiencing this with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. We've got a very special episode for you today. It's very experimental. We're going to be working on parched corn, and a very, very important part of living life in the 18th century and even the 17th century. Thanks for joining us today on this episode. Corn was such an important food for the Native Americans and the settlers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century that we really have to spend a lot of time on it. It is a very, very interesting topic, and corn was prepared and used in so many different ways. Sometimes when it was green, when it first came up, or when it wasn't fully mature, and then when it was ripened and dried. Well, today we're going to be focusing on parched corn, and this particular kind of preparation was so important for long journeys and for storing this food for winter to be used at different times of the year. So this is going to be a lot of fun. There are a number of different descriptions about how parched corn is prepared and a number of different kinds of corns that we are going to be using today. And one of the reasons for this diversity is because this product was made over a long period of time by a lot of different kinds of people. So you can imagine there are many different ways to do it. That's what we're going to have fun with, experimenting with all these different kinds of corn and all these different kinds of preparation methods. I've got some small kerneled popcorn. Popcorn is actually very similar to 18th century corn in that it is a flint corn, and many of the kinds of corns that they had there in the 17th and 18th century, the Native Americans, they had a very small kerneled corn. It was actually sought after. I've got a little bit of, this is hominy corn, actually not made into hominy yet, but made to be turned into hominy. It looks like a bit of a dent corn. It's just a yellow corn, looks very interesting. I've got some hominy here, some dried hominy. That's going to do some very interesting things. And I've got just some straight Indian corn. It's a mix of colors. It looks like a flint corn. It doesn't have any dent in it. That should work well too. Lots of different corns, lots of things to experiment with. Let's get started right now. You know, the first method I'm going to try out here is very, very simple.
Kind of reminds me of how we did the roasting the coffee over the open fire. I've got a little frying pan here. I'm just gonna start off with my just straight Indian corn, and I'm gonna toss it in this frying pan. It's kind of been pre-warmed up. This method really is the most obvious one, but you definitely have to have a certain kind of pan to do it with. This also is only gonna work obviously with some kinds of corn. So as this starts to warm up and starts to get heated, you wanna keep this moving in the pan, and you can start to hear the kernels popping. Now this isn't like real popcorn. If it was real popcorn, it'd be blowing out of the pan, and that's why for this particular method, I'm not gonna bother to use the actual real popcorn because it would be flying everywhere. But that was one of the things that happened in the 18th century, and one of the reasons why we'll talk about other methods here in a little bit. Okay, most of the kind of popping is done here, and for now at least, I'm gonna call this batch done. You can see some of it popped like we would expect popcorn to pop. Most of it did not pop, which is fine. That's gonna work out. It's gonna be good too. Next up here, I'm gonna be using some of this dried hominy corn. Pour a batch of this in. Hominy is another method of preparing corn for later use or use at the time. This is corn that's soaked in lye, and it's soaked for a long period of time. This releases the outer husk of the corn, and it also does some other things to it, making it give it a different taste and a different texture. Very good for sort of long-term storage also. Okay, I've got the hominy corn out. In fact, maybe it got just a little more brown, but hey, this is an experiment. We're not sure how anything is gonna turn out perfectly. I've got some of this yellow corn. It's a dent corn, and we'll put that in. Some references I've read have talked about have talked about parched corn being basically popcorn, and kind of referring to it as if it popped open a lot. I doubt that was true most of the time. It's hard to say what the moisture content was in any particular person's corn. So they might have gotten to a popcorn stage and it popped open rather vigorously, and other times possibly it didn't hardly do anything but just basically crack open. So you might be wondering, so what is the point of doing parched corn? Well, there's a lot more to it than just simply toasting it. We're actually driving out any excess moisture. And another thing that's happening is that we're turning a super hard kernel into something that's much more easily ground up or pounded up with a mortar and pestle. It's also changing the flavors of it. We're changing some of these starches to sugars, and this toasting action is going to give it a completely different flavor than you would expect from just mere cornmeal. So there's many different kinds of things happening. And as we take our parched corn and we grind it up, we're actually going to be taking it and putting it into a much more compact form at the same time. This in turn creates the perfect food, the perfect survival for food, if you will, because it has almost complete nutrition, or at least let's say it's nutritious, has a lot of energy and packed in for the amount of weight that you get, and it's not in a big bulky form either. So here's where the real experimenting comes in. There's another method for preparing parched corn that when I first read it, I think, okay, this isn't gonna work, right? But here, let me read to you. This is a piece out of Benjamin Franklin's piece on, he had a pamphlet basically on maize, right? So here's what he talks about. He says, an iron pot is filled with sand and set on the fire till the sand is very hot. 2 or 3 pounds of grain are then thrown in and well mixed with the sand by stirring. Each grain bursts and throws out a white substance twice its bigness. The sand is separated by a wire sieve and returned into the pot to be heated again, and repeat the operation with fresh grain. Now, I don't know about you, but if it's like real popcorn, you would think all that sand would get mixed in with the popcorn, and the last thing I want to be doing is eating sand
but we're gonna try out this method anyway. Let's get working on this sand pot. So as odd as this method may sound, it starts to make sense when you understand what happens when you don't have a lot of materials or a lot of tools to use. This method undoubtedly was used pre-European contact by the Native Americans, when the only vessels they had were simple clay pots that they fashioned themselves. This heats the kernels all the way around all at once. So there's another variation of this pot method. Instead of sand inside of the cast iron pot or the clay pot, you can use salt. And of course, having salt inside of my popped corn that doesn't get loose after you shake it, that sounds a lot more palatable than sand in there. Again, this is in Benjamin Franklin's little maize pamphlet. He says, "The sand is separated by a wire sieve and returned into the pot to be heated again and repeat the operation with fresh grain." So, of course, Native Americans may not have had a wire sieve. He talks about using a wire sieve, but here we're using a basket, one of our potato baskets, to use as the sieve portion. If we were doing it the other method, we could try to get all the sand kernels off, and in this case, all the salt kernels off of our corn, although I wouldn't mind leaving a little bit. And here's our final preparation method. This one's probably the strangest one of all, probably the most, I don't know, experimental. We'll see how it turns out. What we're gonna do is, now that I've had the fire going for quite a while, I'm gonna spread out my layer of embers, and then I'm just gonna pour the corn right onto the embers, and we'll see what happens. I have not tried this method before, so it's really an experiment. This is basically the only method if you don't have any utensils with you at all. If you don't have any pots, you don't have any pans, and still you want to cook up this corn to make it so that you can eat it some way, this is going to be the method you use. There we go, here we go. This is our pan. I haven't got it all separated yet, but I've scooped out some of the kernels here, and you can see nice popped kernels are still hot. The embers are still in here. And separating them, that's going to be the hard part with this. We might be able to use a basket when this is completely cooled off. More than likely, we just sort of spread this out on the ground and you know, get the embers away and pick out the little corn kernel pieces. Maybe you would do this on the fire, and you'd put the embers down and you'd put the corn on, and then you would smother the fire. I'm not sure. I've only read a couple of instances of this. It isn't a method as well documented as the other ones, but it certainly looks interesting. I'm not sure if I want to, you know, work too hard at picking all these out. It does have another addition, a good thing though, that comes with it, and that is the ashes that get stuck to the corn are actually good for you. When mixed with the corn, they release more nutrients, and so this is actually one of the, probably the most nutritious ways that we could fix this, if we could separate out, you know, all the charcoal and everything else. Well, there you go. We have parched multiple different kinds of corn using multiple different kinds of methods, and they each, well, they were all very interesting. The real question now is, how do we prepare this so that we can eat it? How do we make it palatable? And what does it taste like? That's next week's episode. We're gonna have a lot of fun with that, so make sure to tune back in next week when we figure out how to make this into something we can eat. I wanna thank you for coming along with us as we experiment, as we try these things out. How do we rediscover what happened 200-300 years ago with corn? This is so much fun. I want to thank you for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. In our last episode, we parched corn. We spent time over the fire getting these kernels ready, parching them up. Now we have to prepare them, turn them into something we can actually eat. Thanks for joining us today. Let's hear what Benjamin Franklin has to say about this next step. He says, "That which is parched is pounded into powder in mortars. This being sifted will keep long fit for use. An Indian will travel far and subsist long on a small bag of it, taking only 6 or 8 ounces of it per day mixed with water." So we've got our mortar here, and we need to pound it up into a powder. That's what we're gonna do.
Well, let's get to pounding this stuff up. I've got my my mortar. Now this one is not as big as they probably typically would have had. I mean, you can imagine a log this big around and maybe this tall and a much bigger stamper. This is a very small version, but it's gonna work nonetheless. Probably a lot more portable. It doesn't really matter. I think all these are probably gonna work very similarly. Let's start out with this. And I'm not gonna fill this cavity up too big, but let's see what happens. Boy, this crushes so easily. This is very brittle stuff. You can start to see it. It only takes a few seconds and really all the kernels are already broken. If you've ever tried to do this with real corn, you'd know that you'd be pounding on this thing forever to get this to break up. So this makes it so much easier. I didn't notice it before while I was actually making the parched corn, but as soon as you start to break it up, you get this terrific smell. This stuff smells wonderful. As soon as you've got some of it broken down, the real fine stuff is starting to get in the way. So I can actually pour it into our sieve here and then shake out the fine stuff and then put the grit right back in. I'm gonna go ahead and mix up the Indian corn I did earlier along with the yellow corn because they look almost exactly the same once they're parched. I don't think they're gonna have a lot of different flavor. I'm gonna go ahead and keep this hominy separated to see if it has a different flavor, but we're gonna grind it up the same way we did the other. Here are the two bowls. We've got the, this is the hominy corn, or the actual dried hominy that's pounded up after it was toasted, baked, parched. And here's the standard corn, both the Indian corn and the yellow corn mixed up. And of course I've got the grits here left over. Now we're not gonna actually cook these grits, but they would have been prepared by boiling them in water for 2-3 hours, maybe even 4 hours to make a special dish. We don't have time to do that today. Maybe we'll do that in a future episode. But what have we got here? This powdered meal would have been eaten in 3 or 4 different ways, possibly more, but we've got some very simple ways. This would have been taken on the trail and eaten. Basically, put this in a leather bag, take it along with you. This is all you've got to eat. You'd mix this with water, and we can do that. We can, without even cooking it, take a quantity of this meal. We're gonna put it in a little bowl here and mix it up with an equal quantity of water. Possibly if we're on the trail and we don't want to even start a fire, we can prepare it in this manner and eat it, and it might not be the tastiest thing in the world, but it is sustenance if we have to keep moving. And wow, it looks very palatable, doesn't it? Kind of a cold mush. Now maybe we'd let this set a while to soak up. It doesn't necessarily say that, so I guess we're gonna try it out just like this. Let's give it a try. Definitely an interesting flavor. There's a lot of flavor here. I mean, if you just took straight cornmeal, you probably wouldn't think it tasted like anything. This, in its essence right here, definitely gives you a flavorful feeling. It's sort of like eating solid coffee, or coffee grounds maybe. But maybe, I don't know, I've never eaten coffee grounds, so it has to be much worse than this. But it's got a little bit of a burnt flavor, but that also kind of brings in a saltiness that you wouldn't expect out of something that is totally unseasoned at all. So it's actually got a lot of flavor to it, even in this totally cold sense. Let's try maybe baking it up a little bit, seeing if we can make it a little bit more palatable. So let's try cooking this up. I'm gonna add a little bit of water here to our pan. And we're gonna use the hominy meal this time. Let's stir this up. I don't want to overcook this. It seems to cook up pretty rapidly. Now, if I really wanted this to break down, I'd probably cook this really, really slowly. Maybe I'd take a little brass kettle
and make a very a porridge out of it. Let's see how warm it is here. Yeah, it's nice and warm. So I didn't necessarily cook it up a whole lot. I just wanted to try this out to see what happens when we get it warm. It did a little bit of cooking here. You could see you don't want to heat this up too quick. Yeah, well, again, it's got a lot of flavor to it. It's bringing a lot of that burnt flavor in. So, you know, depending on the kind of taste you want, you might not want to take your parched corn as far as I did. Many of the corn that I used in this kind of really blackened it up. If you like that kind of burnt popcorn taste, then maybe this is the perfect thing for you. I can tell that it definitely would have a lot of flavor compared to some bland things. Again, this is completely unseasoned. There's definitely a lot of flavor here. Maybe not something that our modern palates are expecting. So not only can we eat this paste either hot or cold, but there's another way we can actually eat this, and that is as a drink. And this is mentioned in multiple different accounts, and specifically the Iroquois had a drink called sagamite, where they would take this same sort of meal and add it to water, where it's mostly water, and let that set like a tea possibly, and then drink the water off of the top of that, leaving the meal behind, maybe even straining it out. So I've let our sagamite, they don't actually know exactly what sagamite was like, but I'm guessing here. Other drinks were exactly the same kind of way. Let's test this out. I've kind of let this steep for a little while, like you would let tea brew, but it's just in room temperature water. Let's find out what it tastes like. Actually, very nice, slightly flavored water. I'm sure that we could probably brew this in a couple of different ways if we wanted to bring out more of the flavor. But if you wanted to give your water something a little extra, maybe it didn't come from the cleanest source, maybe it's got an off taste to it, this might be a good way to bring some flavor into it and maybe push down the flavors you don't like so much. But there's a lot of different things you can do with this. One of the last ways, at least we're going to try in this episode, is a simple ash cake. We can take our meal, mix it up with a little water into a paste, and cook it right on the coals. Just like we've done ash cakes before. If you're interested in more on ash cakes and different ways of making them, make sure to check back. I'll put a link down in the description section that points to our other ash cake episodes, or at least episode. Okay, here's our ash cake. It's all cooked up, and it's still got some little coals stuck to it. We can just brush that off. It's a little charred around the edges. We can just break that off and mix into a nice little bread, sort of like cornbread. Again, this is completely unflavored with anything, no salt, no nothing. Got a nice texture to it. Got that same kind of flavor, maybe not quite so strong. Actually makes a really good ash cake, depending on how you cook your parched corn. Excellent way to cook it. So there's so many different methods that you can prepare this parched corn and eat it, even in this meal form. So these have been two pretty intense episodes, a lot of information. We did, we parched the corn, then we ground it. We tried different types of cooking methods, different types of corns, and then different kinds of ways to cook it. There's so much to learn about parched corn, and I'm only just skimming the surface. There's more to learn. It's one thing to read it in a book. It's another to actually try it out. We learn so much more when we try these things out rather than just reading it, right? I love this. I want to thank you for coming along as we try these things out, as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. In this episode, we're mixing two things that have gotten a lot of interest lately on the channel. One is North American corn recipes, and the other one is eels. That's right, we're going to be working with eels. Thanks for joining us today. So located just here, 15 miles south of our store in northern Indiana, there's a waterway, a river, and it's called the Eel River. There is this hidden feature right on the river that one could easily miss. if they didn't know what they were looking at. This is a stone fish weir that was built by the indigenous peoples long ago. The fish weirs were used to harvest fish. They worked by funneling migratory fish into a single point of the river, where basket traps were placed to collect the fish. And in our research, we found 2 different 18th century travel journals, including that of John Heckewelder, a Moravian missionary who lived among the Lenape people. These journals mentioned the Eel River Indians, the native peoples whose name was derived from this very same river. So we're pleased today to present a traditional food that was likely enjoyed by native peoples and settlers alike. We're especially excited about this dish because of its possible connections to the history of this area, history that's right under our feet right here in northern Indiana. So what we're doing here today is another take on succotash. We have done 2 different episodes on succotash, a summer succotash and a fall succotash, but this is just another kind of variation on it. But this one's got a little different ingredients. Now the main ingredient on all these things, a real staple here, is corn. And we're starting off with a dried hominy corn. This corn has already been processed in a process that the Native Americans used so often that would strip the hulls and kind of sort of cause it to swell up, and then they went ahead and dried it. The corn we're using today is actually from our good friends at the Iroquois White Corn Project. Great people. The corn that they use is a variety that's over 2,000 years old, and it works really well. This is the hulled white corn product, which is a kind of a hominy corn. This is great stuff. The best way to get this corn ready to go into our succotash is to actually cook this overnight in a slow cooker. You can do this without a slow cooker, but you'll need to simmer it for several hours to really get that water into it. It'll puff up, and you can really see that it's definitely changed its texture. But a slow cooker overnight on low with several inches of water over that, and it absorbs a lot of water, like say rice, takes up a lot of room. But this is, you're gonna need to pre-prep this, okay? So we can go ahead now and for our succotash here, we've got about 1 gallon of water in our pot, and I'm gonna put in a goodly portion of our prepped corn. Now for the rest of our ingredients, we have squash, one of the ones that's mentioned, one of the things that's mentioned in some of these writings. We also have a root vegetable here, and some root vegetables are mentioned. This is celery root, and we'll put in a little bit of that. I mean, you could put potatoes, I suppose, or maybe a parsnip. Now I've got some heritage beans here. These are soaked beans. These are actually given to us by our good friends down at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, an amazing, wonderful historic site that's down there. That's early 19th century, wonderful site. If you're in that Indianapolis area, you really got to check the site out. They provided these beans for us. We soaked these beans overnight. Let's toss some of those in. And the last thing I'm going to put in now is a little salt and pepper. It's not necessarily likely that, of course, Native Americans would have had salt and pepper at least early on, but we're going to add it for our flavor. Now, before we put in our last ingredient, this is actually going to need to simmer for a little while, or actually boil for a little while, probably 45 minutes, we're guessing, but until these root vegetables get nice and soft and the beans have softened up a little bit. And the final ingredient that's going to go in here, it's not ready yet to put these in, but the eels get to go in next. In the writings of George Laskill in 1794, he mentions the Lenape and the Iroquois peoples. They'd made soup or stew with corn and smoked eels. These eels are going to need to have a little prep work done to them, so I'm actually going to have Kevin come in, talk to us a little about eels, and maybe do a little work to them.
You know, we've been wanting to do an eel recipe for a long time, and frankly, we haven't, because we haven't been able to find them. And we finally found a source for smoked eels. These eels come out of Holland. I've always kind of wondered, why is there this river in Indiana called the Eel River? Because there aren't eels in Indiana. Interestingly, though, there used to be. Eels are a migratory fish, and they swam thousands of miles up the tributaries to spawn and then they would swim back out to the ocean. And so the eels in Indiana, the eels in the Eel River, would actually end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Today in North America, you're going to find eels primarily in saltwater tributaries. Eels, they were everywhere in North America. Very, very common, used to be, no longer today. I'm going to show you how to prepare one of these eels. Now, this eel is very perishable. It's smoked, yes, but probably the way that Native Americans smoked them would have been to smoke them until they were dry, a lot like a jerky. So we're going to use what we have. So here we go. I'm going to start by taking one of these eels. Now these eels have already been gutted, so I'm going to start just by cutting their heads off. I'm going to cut behind the small fin right here. You can save these for later for like soup, things like that. I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to run the knife right along the backbone. The rib bones are very, very fine, and we're probably just going to end up with those in our meat, and you probably won't even know that they're there, all the way to the tail. Now this eel is already fully cooked, and so it's very delicate. So if you're using an eel like this, you're going to have to be careful with this process. Now beyond this, because those rib bones are so fine, I'm not going to worry about them. I'm going to try and get to our spine, and I'm just going to pull this spine out, try and save as much meat as I can. Now I have these two fillets, a little rough, but they'll do for our soup. Now, you can leave the skin on and you'll get more of that of the fish flavor and the smoky flavor in your soup. I think John's going to thank me later for doing this, by the way. I'm going to go on ahead and cut the meat off of the skin, and it's real easy to do. And I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to cut it into chunks. And we're going to get some real nice smoky flavor from some of that meat. So our eel meat is ready to be added to the soup.
I'm going to go ahead and put the eel skins in just for about 10 minutes or so to release some of that flavor, and then we'll pull them back out a bit like a bay leaf. And now in goes the meat. Now this is really only going to need to cook for another 5 minutes or so. And now at the very end here, we're going to put in just a little chives at the very top, and now it's almost ready to serve. Here it is. It's time to test this out. I've got Kevin here to help me out because, I mean, eel chowder. We'll find out. Or, I mean, eel succotash.
Yeah, succotash. Woo! There you go.
So let's give this a taste.
Wow. You know, a little more salt, little more pepper.
The eel really held together. Got a great texture. In fact, there's all kinds of textures here.
Mm-hmm. You have the corn underneath.
That hominy flavor.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's a beautiful broth.
Yeah, it turns out with a beautiful broth. You know, we went ahead and put those skins in there, and you could see the oils come right up to the top of this. So this is a nice, you know, rich with those oils that brought in a lot of the flavor, and gave it a nice rich broth. We went ahead and took those skins out. But it did not have any, you know, we don't have any, really, this is not fishy at all.
Not at all.
Not fishy
Not at all.
So great flavors and this great connection, not only to North America and these different cultures coming together, because eel is very common in the European foodways as well as the Native American. And succotash was definitely one of those foods that was, you know, adopted by the Europeans that came to North America.
This makes me appreciate very much the history of our local area. It's like history under our feet. I knew of the Eel River ever since I've lived here. I never knew the connection. the historic connection,
Right.
and where that name came from, and to be able to actually taste this food that likely would have been eaten in one
Right here.
variation or another
Yeah.
right here is just really amazing. You know, if you don't have eel, I'm thinking, you know, even herring or even an anchovy, I think you could get away with
Some of
this.
that similar.
The oiliness, because I mean, I say oiliness, but that just contributes to the broth, the flavor of the broth. This is not an you know, overly oily at all. So
Very easy to make. This takes a little bit of time, but anything you want to do that turns out, you know, really good, it takes time. So take the time, try to get some eel, definitely get some of this corn because it is really, really good. And you can make this amazing dish. We're here today, we're out in the woods, and we're talking about how to stay warm, how to start a fire. Nicholas Cresswell and so many of these other guys that are in the wilderness, they have to stay warm, they have to build a fire. I've got Dan Wowak with me today. He does wilderness skills instruction, and we're gonna be talking about fire. So tell me about fire, how to make it, what they would have had.
Well, their preferred method of starting fire would have been flint and steel. That's the technology they would have used. But before you even get to that, it's very important that you know the triangle of fire. So the triangle of fire is heat, oxygen, and fuel. If you have all three elements, you'll have fire. If you lose any one of them elements, you don't have fire. So it really is broken down that easily. Now, fire is much more complicated because there's a lot of factors that go into it, but it always boils back down to that triangle of fire. So even when we used our flint and steel set, it's all about that triangle of fire.
Right.
So let's look at a flint and steel set here. So flint and steel technology it's quite simple actually. It's a hardened piece of metal and a piece of flint. And when you strike this, it's going to create a spark. So when I strike my striker off my piece of flint, we're creating spark. Now what a lot of people don't realize is that how this actually works is we have a hardened piece of steel, but we have a harder rock. So this rock is removing metal from our striker every hit. So when it removes that metal, it's combusting in the air, and that's giving us our low temperature spark. So with this alone, we can't have a fire. These sparks aren't just gonna just light a piece of wood on fire.
We could try it and it wouldn't burn.
It's not gonna do anything. So we need a medium to create an ember. And that's where either charred material of what's around us or natural char, or some type of charred cloth. And that's what we're gonna start with first is charred cloth.
Okay.
So let's look at first the technique of actually how we're gonna ignite this char cloth. We want to think about our piece of flint as a razor blade. And that razor blade is removing metal from our striker. So at a 45-degree angle upward is going to be most ideal. And when you hit this with your piece of metal, you want to think about removing that material. So imagine you're using this razor blade to slice that off. So you don't need a lot of pressure, and it's more of a slicing motion than it is a hitting motion. So we're just slicing downward, and the majority of those sparks are rolling over the top. So at that point, we would take something like our charred cloth, and we place that on top of our flint that's at a 45-degree angle, and then what we can do is begin to strike this.
Oh, and you caught right there.
Give it a little bit of oxygen, and we have a lit piece of char cloth.
So we have heat, we have, you know, we've got oxygen, but we need some fuel, really, right?
So we have an ember there, and now we need some fuel. So that's where a bird's nest or a tinder bundle come into play. So let's look at actually how we build that, and then we'll reignite a piece of this and blow it to flame.
Okay.
There's a multitude of different ways we can make bird's nests. So starting with just tree bark, we can look at inner bark from tulip poplar, inner bark from basswood, even bark from a cedar tree, or what I collected here earlier is some birch. So all of that will work really well. And it's always great to team different things up together. So not only the inner bark, but you can take something like some of this dried grass that we found down near the pond, and then something like this cattail, which fluffs up really well. It doesn't ignite too well, but it's a very good ember carrier, so it will extend our ember. So adding all of this into a bird's nest is really well. Once we place our ember inside and we add oxygen to that triangle of fire, we now have heat from the ember, fuel from our bird's nest, and we add the oxygen, and we should, at that point, have flame.
Right. So let's make a bird's nest.
Okay. One thing that is very important is when you create a bird's nest, you don't want to make it that it looks like a bird was sitting in it. You want more depth this way, front to back. rather than really big. So you can see I have some thickness there. So when that ember starts to burn in, it has somewhere to burn into.
Right.
So let me grab a little bit of this cattail, and I'll put this in here just as a extender, just like that. Now, if you can give me some char cloth. One thing that's always important with char cloth too is you can always make more. We can always make more out in the field. So if you ever think that the material is a little subpar, just grab a little bit more cloth.
Okay.
And we know it's been a little wet out here, so we can take a little bit extra, and then we can always make some after the fact. So I'm actually going to let you hold this while I ignite the char cloth. Same technique that we just looked at a second earlier. We're going to keep that piece of flint at a 45-degree angle, put our piece of char right on top of it, and get this ignited. Always put your fire-making device away.
There you go.
And now I'm going to place that right in the middle of that bird's nest, and I'm going to begin to give it some oxygen. Now as that burns and grows larger, I can start to close that in because we want to trap that heat in more and give it more fuel around itself. As soon as we have flame, we never want to blow on open flame. And then of course, turn it on itself like this, because that's giving it more fuel, and we know heat rises. So we would take this and place it inside our fire lay.
Right.
And then once that's inside our fire lay, we want to think about how are we going to do this again. So that's where we're going to start to make more charred material. Now to make our charred material, what we want to do is first get some type of tin. So this is just a plain tin container. We're going to actually place this in the fire once we put our material in it. Now, if the tin doesn't have any type of vent, we need to vent it somehow.
Right.
If it seems like it has a hinge or anything like that, it normally has enough airflow out of it that it's going to be fine.
Okay.
So we just open up our tin and we can place our material into it. Now material, we have a bunch of different options. Any type of natural cotton material will work just fine. We also collected some punkwood while we were out there. So punkwood is just that spongy wood that's starting to rot, but it's not totally rotted yet. We can just place that inside. Cattail works fine. Also any kind of pithy plant material that's dry will work good. We're going to place this in the fire and allow it to start to cook. You might see some flame and some smoke coming out of there. That is just the material we place inside becoming carbon at that point. So it's really important we just keep it in there long enough. You can't overcook char, but you can undercook it. 10 minutes will probably be enough for what we have here, and then we'll test it out. Now our char material is off the fire for a good amount of time. We really want that to get to just room temperature in a sense, because if we open that up ahead of time, we introduce oxygen in that triangle fire, it will ignite into an ember.
And it'll burn up and...
Yeah, so we don't want that to happen. So we have to let this cool. A good rule of thumb is if you can handle it and hold it, it's fine. So we open that up and we look, everything has been charred from our punkwood to our cloth, and we are ready then to make our next fire.
And if it doesn't get all burned up properly?
Then you can just put it back in the fire and just char it a little bit more. So it's not rocket science, it's just very simple. So if it looks brown or there's any color left in the material, put it back in and let it cook a little bit more.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier, if we lost our flint and steel, if we don't have it, what are our other options? I've got a flintlock here.
So flintlock is flint and steel technology.
Right.
So we can use the char cloth right in place of where the powder would be. Of course, you want to make sure that your gun's not loaded.
Right.
But we could just take a swatch of this, place it right down there in the pan.
Yep. We close it.
And then
we can just
go ahead and set it off, and it should ignite the char cloth.
There you go. It's all ignited, and we can just take that right out and put it into our bird's nest.
Yep, and that would be it. So, I mean, it's a very simple process, and there's multiple ways to do it.
Right, and we don't have to have an extra piece of equipment.
Nope.
We can just do it right there.
Nope.
I want to thank Dan for bringing all this great information about fire. It's one of the most important parts about surviving in the woods, in these outdoor environments. We have to stay warm, we have to cook. So this is really the important stuff. We got to know how to do this. Thank you, Dan, for bringing all this great information. If you're interested in learning more about surviving in the woods, in the wilderness, and
all those kinds of things, you'll definitely want to check out Dan's YouTube channel and his wilderness school. Tell us just a few seconds about that.
Yeah, the Appalachian Bushman School. We're located in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Pennsylvania. You can check us out at coalcrackerbushcraft.com for all our classes and everything in between.
We'll make sure to put a link down in the description section. And if you're looking for fire starting materials, you need a flint and steel, because you do, make sure to check out the link we'll have to our website with all sorts of fire starting equipment. Thanks for joining us today. Hey, we're here today with Dan Wowak of Coal Cracker Bushcraft. We're going to be talking about woodland cooking systems. Explain.
Yeah, so we're going to make a variety of different cooking systems. When you're around camp and you have just that campfire going, rather than sticking a piece of meat on a stick and struggling with it or burning it.
I do that. That's
yep.
me.
So rather than doing that, you can make different cook systems with what's around us here in the environment to really make cooking more pleasurable, make your food better.
Right.
Not only make rotisseries, but we can make tripods so we can make better stews and really control what we're doing, because we need to think about the long hunters out there. They had very limited meat at certain times, so they didn't have the option of burning the meat or absolutely dropping it and losing it in the fire, so they had to be a little bit more particular. So if you make a nice cook system, you can not only feed yourself better, but you have multiple men. You could set up cook systems so everybody can do what they need to do around that campfire.
So what do we need for getting this done?
A variety of different branches out here, so we're going to go pick some and then we'll
Okay.
get started with the systems.
So what kind of species and type of wood were we looking for here?
So it depends on the cook system. Species doesn't matter too much as long as it's green wood. We don't want any type of dead wood for the simple fact it's going to be exposed to heat at some point. So we don't want that actually catching on fire. So green wood's going to be best. For the tripod, which I really feel is a quintessential camp tool, because not only can we cook with it, but we can use it for a smoke system to smoke meat, but we can also use it for shelters, smoking hides. It's very important. So with something like this, we want long, straight sticks about 1 inch in diameter.
Okay.
Is good enough. That's going to be good and strong if it's green wood, and about 5 to 6 foot in length is most optimal. You can make them shorter, but this longer length just seems to be a
Gives
little
you
bit
more
better.
options, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So the process can be very simple or very complex. We're going to take the middle of the road. We're going to put a proper lashing on this.
Okay.
So if cordage was at a very minimum out in the field, you can just use 1 or 2 wraps and make it sort of work, but we'll put a good lashing on here, and then the way we're going to lash this, we can always remove that cordage when we're done. So it's a very simple thing.
So we can reuse it, yeah.
Yes. So first thing we want to do is get the bottom of our sticks lined up. And again, I cut all of these very close to the same length.
Okay.
So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the sticks where they lay very
Flat,
evenly.
right?
Yep. And I'll take a piece of cordage that I have. Now how you start this can vary. There's no really proper way, so I'm just going to put a loop on here that has a slip knot and start to tighten this down. Now anytime we wrap around the sticks this way is a lashing, and the wrappings inside are the frappings.
Okay.
So first we're going to put a lashing. So we're going to begin to just wrap this around these sticks, and just take your time with this and get it to lay in there properly.
So we looking to bind these up really tight?
Well, you can. It depends on what project. If this was a shelter, I would really want to bind these up good and tight so it doesn't move. One option you could do to bind these up tight is take just an extra piece of stick that I gathered while I'm out there and use it as a toggle just to tighten that up. Now you see how that bunched up? We don't want that to happen. So we're going to just open that back up a little bit and use our knee right here to keep that in line. And I'm just going to tighten that down. So for every 3 lashings, 1 frapping is a good idea. So it doesn't have to be exact, but as long as we're close with that, I think it's going to hold up just fine for us. So I'm done my lashings there. I will grab my toggle again just to put a little bit of tension on that. Now I'm going to begin my frappings. So I'm going to go in between each of this and around. And this is really what's going to bind up and make this work more properly. Now you might have to play around with this a little bit to get it to
fit
work.
between,
Yep. And I'm just going to continue. I'll put 2 frappings.
Okay, around, in between each one of those,
In between each one of those. And really that'll be it then at this point. So we made our lashings and our frappings. Now to finish this off, you could do several different things. We're just going to put a half hitch in here just to hold it.
Simple, yeah.
Just something simple to hold it in place, and we will be set to go. So should we give this a try now over the fire
let's see.
pit? All right, so very simple, just open it up. And you can feel it's a little bit tight now, but that will adjust over time as we loosen up on that.
And this is our leftover?
Now, yeah, so we always want to make sure that we have leftover cordage because it's very simple. Then we take that toggle I was using to tighten down that lashing, and with just a very simple slip knot, so I place that simple toggle on if you'd like to grab that pot.
Yeah.
And then we just use that bail to hold our pot in place.
Look at that.
Now the beauty of this system is, number one, we can make very fine adjustments by just sliding our tripod in. See, we got some height. Or if you want to grab that leg and open that up, we can even get lower. And then if we need other type of adjustment, we can also always wrap this over the top.
Sure.
And we can really get that high off of the fire. And that way, if we need to simmer something, it works really well. So you can see how well this works with something.
Yeah, it's so simple and
Very
is
simple.
so versatile.
Yep.
Yep. So what have we got here?
So we're gonna make a pot suspension system. And the beauty of this system is that you can put multiple pots on the campfire. You can make it as big as you would need. So if you have a real big long fire and multiple minute camp, everybody can use the fire equally. So what we're gonna need to do is we need 2 uprights that are Y branches.
Okay.
Now these can vary in length. I like to say around 3 foot in length is best with a Y on top. And then on the outside of your fire pit, you're gonna just push them straight down inside. So if you wanna give a little push down to that one, get them as level as we can. And then what we're gonna do is just take a straight branch that's long enough to go across both of them. Just like that. And you can level this system out as much as you would need to, but it looks pretty good right now. So you might be thinking, what actually are we gonna do with this? I mean, we just have a bar hanging there. Well, we make hangers. So there's different types of hangers we can make. This hanger right here is just a Y branch, so it was growing up this way. We trimmed it here, and I put a notch up top.
Right.
But we're actually gonna flip that to use it. So when we hang our pot, we use that notch, and we can hang it this way over the fire. You could put multiple notches up on here, and that will allow the pot different heights depending what you need.
Sure.
Then we can also take 2 Y branches if we have some extra twine or cordage with us and tie them off. So I have 1 Y branch that was growing this way and another one that was growing this way, lash them together, hang that on here.
Right.
And then you can hang your pot on there.
Right.
Also. So as you can see, we're a little close to the fire there, so making multiple hangers is going to be most beneficial. And again, you could take this up as high as you would want or as low as you want, depending on what you're actually doing.
And we could hang other things on this other than the pots. We could probably, you could even hang a piece of meat on that if you needed to.
Yep, or if
whatever.
you took sliced meat and you skewered it through, you can hang it almost like a kebab and then just cut it as it cooks.
Right. So what do we got here?
Well, this is very similar, the setup to the last pot suspension system. So we still have the Y upright branches, but you can see that I lowered them a lot.
Okay.
And the reason I lowered them is we're actually going to make a rotisserie. So if we have any type of meat source, we can actually rotisserie it over the fire. Now to do that, rather than just that single straight stick, I took another Y branch and then I lashed a smaller branch onto that. And the reason for that is if we put just a piece of meat on a round branch, it's gonna spin and we can't get that rotisserie effect. So this is gonna work as a clamp. Once we skewer our meat and tie it down, then the meat's not gonna go anywhere. We can lay this across the Y branch just like this. And the reason this is a Y is because we can then use that to
incrementally rotate it.
Yes. Yep, so we're gonna do that and we can just turn it around that way. Now, this morning I actually harvested a rabbit, so we can put the rabbit right on the skewer and take a look at what it looks like.
Okay.
So I now have this lashed on, and you can see as I rotate this, it's not sliding on the spit itself.
Right.
So we can set it right in place here like this, and then as we need to rotate that, we would just do so. So it works really well this way, to just constantly keep rotating that and get a good, nice, even roast all around it.
Well, we've got meat, we got the cooking system. I suppose we should get a fire going and cook this rabbit up. This reminds me so much of what's going on in Nicholas Cresswell's journal. They're traveling into the backcountry.
they don't have very many provisions, and many of the provisions they have with them get spoiled along the way. They are eating off the land as they travel. You know, whatever game they can get a hold of, that's what they're cooking. They're eating in the most simplistic way possible.
So the rabbit has been cooking now for about 25 to 30 minutes. And in the spirit of the long hunter, we're just gonna eat right off the stick here. So we'll cut ourselves a little section. I'm gonna cut some of this back strap off for us, right through here. Get you some meat right off that.
Hey, it looks done, yeah.
Yeah. I'll give it a little taste here.
Smoked rabbit.
Yeah, rotisserie style.
Yeah.
Really good. And if you're hungry and didn't eat for a couple days, it'd be really good.
Yeah, and no gaminess at all on this thing.
Nope.
It's wonderful, basically chicken flavor, really.
Yeah.
In this episode, we'll be demonstrating a food preservation technique that is really meant to show historical methods, but is not meant to meet modern food safety standards. I'm here with Dan Wowak of Coal Cracker Bushcraft, and we've been talking a little bit about, well, a lot about Nicholas Creswell's journal. Nicholas Creswell was a young Englishman. He was touring North America looking about what his future life was going to be like. He's wondered if this was where he wanted to settle. And he had some adventures in the back country. And let me read this particular journal entry, and we're going to try to reproduce this. This is May 18th, 1775, and he's probably in what is now Kentucky. He says, "All hands are employed in curing our buffalo meat, which is done in a peculiar manner. The meat is first cut from the bone in thin slices like beefsteaks. Then 4 sticks are stuck in the ground in a square form. Small sticks are laid on these forks to form a gridiron about 3 feet off the ground. The meat is laid on this and a slow fire put under it, and it is turned until it is done." And then he says this is called jerking the meat. That's what they referred to it during the time. It answers very well where salt is not to be had, and it will keep a long time if it is secured from the wet. So does this sound like a typical, you know, like cooking method you would do?
Yeah, so anytime you're going to preserve meat, smoking's a great resource to do that, and you can use just about everything in the environment to help us get that going.
And he describes
exactly what
a
we
method
need to do.
just like we've kind of done a little bit earlier. So we're going to reproduce that. What do we need for this?
So we're going to get the 4 sticks that have Ys on the top, so forked sticks, and then we'll get a bunch of straight sticks that are going to create that grill top in a sense.
Right.
And then once we lay that over, we're going to take it one step further though. We'll put a tripod over it and then wrap it with some extra material that we have here, and that's going to help trap the smoke in and allow it to cure a little bit quicker.
So I got our buffalo meat that we cut up earlier. If you're going to try this at home, make sure to try to get this cut across the grain as much as possible. This is regular buffalo, and we're just going to lay it out on our gridiron here. There you go. Have a piece here. Some of these pieces aren't beautiful, but you know, sometimes the buffalo fights you. So
now we're smoking the meat, so we have the meat set on our rack that we built. What we're going to do is take just an old scrap of cotton canvas, and we're going to wrap it around this tripod. It's going to help block that smoke. Right now we don't have a lot of smoke, but we have a good bed of embers, so we can feed that with dry wood. We don't want a lot of flame and heat, so we'll feed that with not only dry wood, but then green wood, because that green wood's going to give a nice smoke, and we really want this to get super smoky in here and dry this meat out. So we'll just take this old canvas and wrap it carefully around this tripod to start to trap in all that smoke. When you're doing this, you always also want to be careful that none of this is down too low that it's going to actually catch fire. So we can just fold that up the best we can, and that's going to help trap a lot of that smoke inside to dry out that meat. So let's get that fire stoked up and we'll be good to go. A lot of the skills that I've learned were passed on from many different individuals over the years. If it was not people who directly spoke with me, it's from their writings and teachings that they have written in books and journals. I would like to pass a lot of this information on to my son so he has a better understanding of what it took for individuals to come to this new land and prosper and make lives for them and their own families.
Here is our dried buffalo meat, kind of smoked and dried. And this is what they would have been doing on the trail to preserve their buffalo. And you know, Cresswell talks about this completely, gives us this whole process. So we tried this out. It took longer than I expected. You know, we dried it for several hours, and then we kind of basically had to let it go all night long before it really got nice and dry. And really what we're looking for is drying it, not cooking it. And you can see by these finished pieces, they're kind of black and they kind of crack open. They're not real soft. If they're soft, they're gonna rot. And he talks about how if you keep them dry, they're gonna last a long time. Now, maybe for a long time for him was, you know, a couple of weeks or a month, but now the question is, what do we do with these? Now we can try eating these just like they are. Here you go, Dan, you give one, get a try, pick one out there. In this state, you know, it's tough, it's dry.
It's meat.
Yeah, it's
If
meat.
you're hungry, it'd be great.
Right. It's good. Definitely, I mean, with the buffalo meat, you got a little different flavor
Yep.
than beef. Nicely smoked though.
Really
got
good
a little,
smoke flavor.
a nice little smoke flavor to it. They wouldn't necessarily just eat it like this. So they might use this, reconstitute it in a stew, you know, put it in the boiling water, kind of let it, you know, kind of reconstitute itself, expand a little bit. It's gonna probably make a really, really interesting stew. Mix it with some of your other ingredients because you don't want to just be eating this on the trail all the time. You want to mix it up, right?
Yep, and I think too we need to realize that they were eating to survive.
Yeah.
So many times now we think about eating for pleasure, where they were eating because they needed to eat to live. So something like this is a pure survival food. A lot of protein, a little bit of fat in there. It's
Yeah.
great to get you through and get you to the next meal.
Yeah,
on
it
your
gives
next
you
time.
energy and all that. Really, the kind of more fat, the better, really, in this
Yeah.
kind of circumstance. He even, you know, Cresswell talks about, he complains that these guys don't want to stick around to take the time to make these provisions, to dry this stuff out. But if you have this dried, ready to go, when you're, you know, headed out to your event, you can have this. Perfect. If you're doing something like Long Hunter, where they would have had this sort of provision with them. So what would you need? A little bit of this?
A little bit of flour or cornmeal, and I think you really have a
Yeah.
full setup of being
Right.
able to go out and then hunt for the rest of your food, fish, and then have this as a backup.
Right. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm John Townsend. Today we are outside because we are cooking the stinkiest recipe yet, stockfish. Woo! Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So what is stockfish? Stockfish is dried cod. They catch cod, they gut it, and then they put it out to sort of dry out, freeze dry it almost, on these big racks in Norway. So you can imagine they have all these thousands and thousands of cod that are drying out in the cold weather. It takes months for these things to dry out completely. Stockfish is a very old type of food preservation technique. They've been doing this for over 1,000 years. Stockfish shows up in English literature. Shakespeare talks about stockfish. There are regulations and laws about stockfish early on. You'll also see some references to stockfish in the 18th century. At one point, we know that it wasn't popular with general people because they actually were trying to encourage the importation of stockfish and stockfish recipes. To help us understand how to use stockfish in a recipe, there's a fascinating entry in Nicholas Cresswell's journal. Nicholas Cresswell was a young man going from England to North America to seek his fortune, and he's on board ship here in 1774. He says, dined on stockfish and potatoes. This fish is cured in the frost without salt. Before it is boiled, they beat it with iron hammers against the anchor stock to soften it. A general dish on Fridays and is reckoned a great delicacy, but to me it is none, for I hate the smell of it. Poor Nicholas Cresswell. But we find out here that they take this stockfish, which you can imagine, how do you cook this into food, and they beat it with hammers to soften it up, and then they boil it.
So I was checking a bunch of different references, cooking references in the 18th century with stockfish, and almost every single reference that talks about cooking stockfish mentions the idea of beating it with hammers. Now, modern day cooking with stockfish, they don't beat it with hammers, but that's what we're gonna do. Let's start prepping our fish by beating it with a hammer. So what we're doing is softening this fish up. If we don't soften it up with a hammer, it will take 3 or 4 days of soaking to make this soft enough to actually do something with it. If we beat it with the hammer, it will take much less time. We might only need to soak it for half a day or just a few hours, or maybe if it's in small enough pieces, we can just toss it right into the boiling water and it'll cook with the potatoes. So let's make a fish stew just like the one that Nicholas Creswell tried to eat but couldn't eat. Here's our fish. We've already got this beat with our hammer, so it's softened up. The pieces are kind of broken up a little bit. Now, the trick here with this fish is we've got skin on it. We've still got bones inside here, cartilage pieces, all kinds of things we don't want to eat necessarily. And while we could toss this in or try to take out bits of it, it's really hard to separate the bones from the flesh unless we just totally pulverize this thing so that the bones broke down too. Sort of like making fish powder. We could do that and then toss it in here. A better way to do it, if we still want to have nice pieces of fish that we can tell are fish, is we want this to soak. Now, we don't need to soak a whole 4 days like we might need to do it if we hadn't pounded it, but this one I pounded last night and then it's been soaking overnight, and you can see that it's really opened up here and we've got some nice pieces of flesh. So let's open this up and try to get out the bones, and we'll toss it into some nice boiling water and get this cooking up. So we're just going to look through here and find any kind of bones. There really doesn't seem to be a lot that's really popping out. You can definitely feel sometimes the backbone, and that you want to get those pieces out of there because that's never going to soften up. But some of these little bones are very soft. I don't think they're going to cause us a problem after this gets cooked. So that looks really good. One of the most fascinating things when you soak this stockfish is to watch how much it expands. It absorbs water and changes its size to 3 or 4 times as thick. It's just amazing to see what happens when this soaks up water. Now that our fish is boiling up, let's take some potatoes and I'm just going to cube them up and we can slide them right in there to boil along with our fish. Our fish and our potatoes are boiling up, and hey, no naval recipe is complete without some ship's biscuits. Ship's biscuits, how do you preserve bread for months at a time? Well, you make ship's biscuits, and they're very, very dense bread that's baked 3 and 4 times. Very hard, very breakable, and we can break up our ship's biscuits into some little tiny pieces and throw it into our stew to fill it up, get it thicker. It really adds some wonderful flavor too. So I'm gonna pound up some ship's biscuits so we can put it in to our stew. I've added some salt and pepper, and we're going to let this boil until those potatoes feel nice and soft, probably about a half an hour. Hopefully, it'll be done about then. Here's our stew, and it actually looks pretty good, and amazingly enough, it does not smell bad at all. So maybe Nicholas Creswell, he got to smell it before it was cooked, so maybe that was the problem, but once it's cooked, it doesn't smell bad at all. So
The question is what does it taste like? Let's get a nice big piece of fish here. Hey, that is surprisingly good. Very nice. The potatoes have kind of grabbed a little bit of that fish flavor, so they taste good. A ship's biscuit in something like this is perfect. If you want to have a little bite left in it, have almost like a little piece of beef. You put it in late so that it doesn't break down too much. If you want it to really sort of fill up and thicken the stew, you want to put it in early, pound it up nice and fine. Either way, it's just so very good. If you really want to, put this right over the top, just a touch of nutmeg would probably make this perfect. But as it is wonderful. Boy, I am so surprised. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and I'm excited about today's episode. We'll be doing a Caribbean-inspired recipe right from the 18th century, Pepperpot. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. This recipe comes from The Lady's Assistant, Charlotte Mason, 1777. This is an English cookbook, but it has this obviously Caribbean-inspired pepperpot recipe. To make pepperpot, to 3 quarts of water, put in a small cabbage, 2 large handfuls of spinach, a head of lettuce, 2 or 3 onions, a little thyme. Cut them very small and let them stew. With 2 pounds of mutton till they are quite tender. Boil with them some little dumplings made of flour and water and a piece of pork, a little salted. A half an hour before it's taken up, put in a lobster or a crab, picked very small and clean from the shell, with a little salt and cayenne pepper. So this pepperpot is really a take on a 18th century pepperpot made in the West Indies and then sort of translated into the English context. You can imagine that Charlotte Mason, the author of this particular cookbook, she didn't go to the West Indies and watch pepperpot being made, and she probably never ate a West Indian pepperpot, but someone came from the West Indies and explained this dish and maybe made it so that she had a chance to sort of interpret it. So we have an interpretation, an 18th century interpretation of an 18th century pepperpot. Probably nothing like a pepperpot is made today, but we're gonna make this recipe. We are gonna tweak it a little bit. It seems like she's very light on the pepper of the pepperpot, so we'll play with that a little bit. First off though, we've got a lot of greens here. I've got some spinach, we've got a cabbage that we're gonna cut up a little bit. We've got collard greens and a little bit of lettuce. We're gonna chop those up nice and small and get them going in our pot right away. Let's add 2 onions diced up nice and fine to add into our greens. So the meat portion of this that we're going to put in today is pork. It's fresh pork. The recipe called for mutton. It was probably an inexpensive cut for the time period. She also calls for a little bit of salt pork. We've got an opportunity here to put in whatever we please here. You could put in some beef, like stew beef, something similar to that. Right here, I've got some pork already diced up into nice smaller pieces. That looks good. It's boiling up. We might leave that boil for half an hour or so, but right now we're gonna work on our hard dumplings. That's the next part of this recipe. She doesn't say exactly when to toss these in, so we're gonna make them up right now. We'll probably let that boil for an hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll toss these in and let them cook for a little bit. But let's make them up now. Super simple. I've got flour here, and I'm just gonna toss in a good bit of flour. I don't know, maybe I have 12 ounces of flour. I'm gonna add just a touch of salt to that. That looks good. And now water, and I'm gonna make this up into a hard paste. It's just flour, salt, water. Add enough. Okay, it's a nice stiff paste. That's what we're looking for. We're just gonna tear it off into, say, walnut-sized little balls. Roll those up like that. There are hard dumplings. We're gonna make sure they're all sealed up. Sometimes they don't have quite, we wanna have a consistency so it all locks together and doesn't wanna fall apart at all, right? That's our dumpling. These are so simple and they show up in a lot of these kinds of soups and stews. If you want some other kind of filler in there, really, really common. This looks really good. It's been slow boiling about an hour, hour and a half. The meat is wonderful and tender. The other things haven't broken down too much, so I don't want to let it cook too long. Next up, in the recipe, it says a half hour before serving or half hour before you take it up, you're supposed to put in either some lobster or some crab meat. And it says that it should be all picked, you know, fine. We don't want any shell, we don't want any big chunks. This should be a fine crab meat here. And remember, in the time period that lobster and crab were probably fairly inexpensive meats here. So this isn't necessarily a super fancy way to fix it up, at least in the 18th century. It might be today. So let me put the crab meat in. And now we get to the namesake of a pepper pot. Let's talk about the pepper. This isn't black pepper or white pepper that's being used in this. It's cayenne pepper, sometimes called Guinea pepper because it came from the Guinea coast of South America. That's what we're gonna put into this. We've got a little bit of salt as it calls for, and then it says cayenne pepper. Does it mean a little bit of cayenne pepper or does it mean a lot? Well, that's up to you, isn't it? Let me tell you, this smells great, and I don't know if I've anything quite like this. Can't wait to try this out. Lots of greens in here, lots of greens. And it's got pork, and it's got crab meat, and it's got the dumplings. So there's a lot of stuff going on in here. Let me find a little bit of the crab meat. There we go. Yes, yes. And I think I put in just the right amount of cayenne. Definitely a pepper pot, not just a, you know, a stew. We've got more things to try out. The greens, we want some other textures in there. We have the dumpling. A little bit of pork. This is great. It may not be exactly like a pepper pot that you know, but it is so good. This really, really interesting 18th century English interpretation of a pepper pot. So we don't usually think of venison as a day-to-day meal, but for the indigenous population in North America in the 18th century, it was common fare. They had it each and every day, and they had it for celebratory occasions. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's dish is from a reading out of the Journal of James Smith. He was writing about his experiences in 1755. As a young man, he was taken captive by the Caughnawaga tribe. And after a few weeks, he was adopted into that tribe through a ceremony and a feast. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. Green corn and venison is what they feasted upon that night. And these two food sources are pretty incredible as we look back upon them. Corn could be used in any number of ways. They cooked them in its immature state, this green corn, but they could also dry it. They could grind it up and use it preserved all through the year. So it was one of the most important food sources for Native Americans. Whereas venison, well, deer were plentiful in the 18th century, and deer are the perfect size. A man can handle it. They're fairly easy to hunt in that time period, and you could still feed a lot of people with it. So it was better than small game, but it wasn't so difficult to deal with as something like a buffalo. They didn't have to worry about preserving it as much. They could eat it before it went bad. So these two items are something that is very common in the diet of Native Americans, and in this circumstance, a common thing for feasting upon. Is that a piece of...
Yep.
As our corn and venison is boiling, let me read to you this segment of the account that we're working from here. He starts, "These young women then led me up to the council house where some of the tribe were ready with new clothes for me. They gave me a new ruffled shirt, which I put on, and also a pair of leggings done off with ribbons and beads, likewise a pair of moccasins and garters dressed with beads, porcupine quills, and red hair. Also a tinsel-laced capo. They again painted my head and face with various colors and tied a bunch of red feathers to one of these locks they had left on my crown of my head, which stood up 5 or 6 inches. They seated me on a bear skin and gave me a pipe and a tomahawk and a polecat skin pouch, which was skinned pocket fashion. When I was thus seated, the Indians came in dressed and painted in their grandest manner. And as they came in, they took their seats, and for a considerable time there was a profound silence. Everyone was smoking, but not a word was spoken among them. At length, one of the chiefs made a speech which was delivered to me by an interpreter, and was as follows. 'My son, you are now flesh of our flesh, and bone of our bone. By the ceremony which was performed this day, every drop of white blood was washed out of your veins, and you are taken into the Caughnawaga nation, and initiated into a warlike tribe. You are adopted into a great family, and now received with great seriousness and solemnity in the room and place of a great man. After what has passed this day, you are now one of us by an old strong law and custom. My son, you now have nothing to fear. We are now under the same obligation to love, support, and defend you that we are to love and defend one another. Therefore, you are to consider yourselves as one of our people.' At this time, I did not believe this fine speech, especially that of the white blood being washed out of me. But since that time I have found that there was as much sincerity in the said speech. For from that day I never knew them to make any distinction between me and themselves in any respect whatsoever until I left them. If they had plenty of clothing, I had plenty. If they were scarce, well, we all shared the same fate. After the ceremony was over, I was introduced to my new kin and told that I was to attend a feast that evening, which I did. And as the custom was, they gave me also a bowl and a wooden spoon, which I carried with me to the place, where there was a great number of large brass kettles full of boiled venison and green corn, and everyone advanced with his bowl and spoon and had his share given to him. After this, one of the chiefs made a short speech, and then we began to eat. He goes on to describe the celebration, the party that happened after the feast, music and dancing. He goes on to describe parts of this adoption ceremony, both before this and after this. It's such an important part of understanding Native American culture, especially from this mid-18th century context, from somebody that it's happening to them. It's not a description from the outside. It's such an important description of something that happened 270 years ago. Green corn, venison, and a little bit of salt boiled. It couldn't be simpler. Let's find out, though, what the taste is like. Let me get just the right bit. So flavorful, so simple. The sweetness of the corn and this venison go together very, very well. It is, I am truly amazed by how simple it is and how rich the flavor is. It's also got some really good texture. That green corn, hasn't broken down too far, so it's not like cream corn or anything like that. And the meat has yet a different texture. So it's great on every level, and it's just so amazingly simple. I really love this one. This is one of those dishes where really all we have is this great description from a journal. You won't find this in any cookbook of the time period because it is so simple, and it's a Native American dish, so we really only get sort of the descriptions of those. But we get to try these things out and get a feel for the context of something like we read in a journal. It really kind of fills in all the gaps for us being able to kind of grasp what was being written about in the time period.
In today's episode, we'll be cooking and eating mushrooms from the woods. If you find mushrooms, but you can't 100% identify them as edible, do not eat them.
The forest this time of year in the spring, it's amazing. It's beautiful. It's glorious. And there's nothing more wondrous than the morel mushroom. Morel mushrooms have a long tradition in my family. And right now, we're in the middle. In fact, we're at peak morel mushroom season. And here they are. These things are glorious. They're wonderful. And my family's been, picking them, hunting them. Really, you don't pick them, you hunt mushrooms. It's funny that my wife's family, the side of the family that's from this area in the Midwest, had a long tradition of looking for morel mushrooms, and yet my wife's mother's family was from out east. They thought they were deadly poison, couldn't believe anybody would eat these things. My question when I find them today, and I want to eat them, but I connect them with the 18th century, and I say, now wait a minute, did they have morel mushrooms in the 18th century? Did they want to eat them as much as I do? Well, if you dig in the 18th century English cookbooks, you will find morel mushrooms. And I do believe they're exactly the same kind of morel mushrooms that we have here today. The range for morel mushrooms is over most of the North American continent. You'll also find them in Western Europe, including Great Britain, even places in China, Japan, and New Zealand, you'll find morel mushrooms. Now, these English recipes, I am not going to use one of the 18th century English recipes that you will usually find morel mushrooms referenced in, because they are sacrilegious. They're terrible because they put these morel mushrooms in with all sorts of other flavors and have them as a tiny component inside of a big expensive dish, like a fish pie or something else. That is terrible. You do not want to do that with morel mushrooms. So I did a little bit more digging. And I said, well, truly the only way to cook a morel mushroom is to fry it, and you eat it by itself. In fact, you don't need anything else, really. You can just make a meal of morel mushrooms if you ask me. So I went digging for fried mushrooms, and yes, Primitive Cookery has the perfect fried mushroom recipe. That's what we're going to do today. These things are the best. Don't ruin it by cooking them any other way. In the cookbook, Primitive Cookery, 1767, it's a great little cookbook. To fry mushrooms, toss up your mushrooms with a little broth to take away their bitterness. Then strew over them salt, pepper, and flour, and fry them in butter or hog's lard. This is kind of funny. It says to fry mushrooms. If you're here in Indiana and someone says, do you want to eat mushrooms? They mean morels. That's what mushrooms are in Indiana. Any of those other things that grow out in the funguses, those aren't mushrooms. Morels are mushrooms. When possible, we want to eat these mushrooms fresh the same day they are picked. These are beautiful, fresh. Some of them picked last evening and this morning. These are ready to go. The preparation is very, very simple. I've already trimmed off most of the dirt. If we had a little bit of dirt, and usually I try to get the maximum mushroom out of the ground, so I'll bring some up with the dirt and very, very carefully take off the root part of our mushroom, and occasionally they will have little problems with them that we might need to trim off. And this one is looking great. So we're going to take our mushrooms and we are going to slice them in half so that we can cook them all the way. These are hollow, and so one of the ways you can tell whether you have a real morel. There are false morel mushrooms and they are poisonous. If it's hollow, that's good. If they have any sort of internal section to them, you probably have a bad mushroom and you don't want to eat that. And you don't want to eat a bad mushroom because they're poison. We're going to place these in our beef broth. If you don't have beef broth, a simple salt water solution is fine for these. They'll absorb a little bit of that beef flavor. That's going to be great. If not, salt water's good too. Some people manage to freeze them. Boy. If you've got enough at all, you really just want to cook them right away and look for any sort of little crud or dirt. The worst part is when you come along and you found the stump of a mushroom. Something's already come along and gotten it, probably a deer or something. It's just terrible. Before we get done, let's look at the individual type of morels. Morels are, well, they come in different varieties, strangely enough. Early on in the season, say around here, mid-April, you get spike mushrooms. And these are morels, but they have a very small head on them. And they are generally very dark colored. They're called spikes because they just have this little tiny pointy top, and that's it. Later on, a week or two later, the grays start to come out. They have a normal mushroom look now, and they are generally kind of grayish in color, and they're middling size. These are usually the peak tasting mushrooms. People really love these. Later on in the season, the yellows come out, and we're in the yellow season right now. They're much larger and they're yellow colored. Now, the question is, are these really all just exactly the same mushroom when they've gotten bigger and bigger? No. No, early in the season, that style comes out and then they disappear. They don't grow into the yellow. They disappear, they dry up, and then these other ones sort of appear. I don't know exactly how it works, and morels are kind of magic anyway. You got to be careful when you're hunting them. You want to be quiet, or else they disappear. Just when you want to find them, they're gone. You got to wear the right clothes too, and have a mushroom stick if you really want to find morels. So we've got these wonderful yellows for late season. Luckily, I was able to find just a couple of these from the earlier seasons. So these guys are ready to do a little bit of seasoning and then putting a little flour on them, and in they go. The recipe just has a little bit of pepper on these guys. Just got a little bit of ground pepper, and we've got a little bit of sea salt. Again, what we want on this is to enhance the flavor, not to hide the flavor. So that's what the salt is for, is to bring out the flavor. But if we have so much salt that we can taste it, we've got too much salt. So I'm going to be very judicious with this. We can always, if we need to, add salt in the eating phase. but we want just a touch here in the cooking phase. Now let's dredge them through our flour, and I'll just set them on this plate. I could dredge them on the flour and toss them right into the pan, but I don't want to do that because I want them all to go into the pan at once so I can watch them cooking. Now let me tell you, I really want to add nutmeg to this, but if there is one dish ever that doesn't need nutmeg, this one's it. Okay, now it is time to cook our mushrooms, and we want to be very, very careful as we're doing this. These mushrooms are not easy to get a hold of, so we're going to be using all the best materials possible. And in this case, I'm not going to be using just any butter, and the recipe said we could use hog's lard. No way. We're not going to be using hog's lard on this. We're going to be using the best butter. We'll be using Kerrygold butter. I definitely recommend using the best possible. We want to be very careful with the temperature of our fire and our cooking vessel. One of the family traditions on my wife's side of the family is there's a big mushroom feed once a year, and the whole family comes together, and the kitchen is filled with these electric frying pans. We're not going to be using electric frying pan, but they use those because they can adjust the temperature precisely. And we need to do exactly the same thing in this circumstance. So I'm going to be very careful. We're using our spider skillet so it stays off of the fire, and we want to have the most regular heat across our pan. We don't want it to get too hot. Just like that. Looks good. Now we can start to put our mushrooms in. And we don't just toss our mushrooms in and walk away, because we do not want them to burn. We so don't want these to burn. So we're gonna watch them the whole time as they cook. This could be just a little hotter. There we go. That's what we want right there. We're gonna let the pan warm up just a little bit more. Remember those English recipes I was telling you about? The complicated ones that would be sacrilegious? These morels were always mentioned in the same phrase, in the same sentence as truffles. You can think of them the same way. Very, very expensive. Morels are the same way. They're precious because they are only available for a couple of weeks a year. And there are some years they're not available at all because the weather's just not quite right. And they cannot be commercially grown. So they are a wonderful, precious thing, and we're going to be very careful in how we cook them. I usually recommend putting these into the pan with the hollow side down first, and as they cook, you can flatten them because you want to cook them, consistently over the entire piece. So if you start with the hollow, then you can flatten them out as they heat up, and then when that bottom side is cooked, you turn them over, and it just takes a little bit after that, and then they're done. You can take them right out of the pan. Once they're out of the pan and they're done draining, you do not want to let these get too cold. They go to the table hot, or at least warm, right? So they started out like that, they end up like this. There's only one way to eat morel mushrooms as far as I'm concerned, and that's with your fingers. And they're nice and crispy. Smelling out of the pan, they are incredible. There's nothing like them. Perfect crunch. Couldn't be better. These are perfect. They're like the woods bottled and concentrated. And the butter matters. You can't taste any of those spices. They're just there just to bring it out. It could not be better. These are perfect. If you've never had a chance to try morel mushrooms, you want to try these. I don't know what you're gonna need to do. Go someplace, trick somebody into serving you morel mushrooms fried like this. You've never had anything like it. They are tremendous. Trade into the interior of North America was a perilous job in the 18th and early 19th century. Voyagers were going deep into the interior of North America to trade with Native Americans for furs and meat. The trade is powered by man, paddling canoes for hundreds of miles, for hours and hours at a time. This takes a lot of food. A voyageur in this time period is burning more than 3,000 calories a day, probably 4,000 or 5,000 calories. This kind of work takes a tremendous quantity of energy. It takes a very calorically dense food source to be able to survive in this job. This would not be possible without pemmican, the ultimate survival food. Pemmican, as referenced in our time period, is a meat source, generally bison. The bison are butchered and the meat is cut into very thin slices across the grain. This is then dried, and the best way to dry it is drying it in the sun. If the meat needs to be dried over the fire, that'll still work, but we need to have a very, very dried meat source. We're trying to drive every bit of moisture out. If we don't, the pemmican won't work right. It won't last. This pemmican is then pounded up into a fiber, almost pulverized. This is mixed then with the suet of the bison, a mixture of 50-50 or maybe 2-to-1 meat to suet. And the suet has to be nice and hot. We want the suet to cover every portion of the meat. This is kind of like the potted meat source that we talked about in previous episodes. The idea is that we don't want any air or any moisture getting to these meat fibers. The prepared pemmican is then placed in a leather bag, and this bag is made from the hide of the bison. It is incredible that basically all the meat and fat from one bison gets dehydrated and packed into the skin of that very bison. This is an incredibly efficient way of processing the animal and turning it into this very, very condensed food source. The people best known for this innovative food are the Métis people in Canada. Now, they are people with French roots and Native American roots, but they're there at the right place and at the right time to turn this needed food product into a whole industry. This was not a new concept in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Pemmican has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years before that. Native Americans all over North America were doing this process with different kinds of meat, especially something like venison. This was a way of making this wonderful food, a very, very dense and nutritious food, but also a food that'll last a long time, and a delicacy at times, depending on how it was prepared. But it's only in this late 18th century and early 19th century context that it turns into a huge industry. The Métis people are already using this as a food source before the early 19th century. But at that point, it is realized that this is the kind of food that everyone needs if they want to get into the interior of North America. When the Native Americans developed pemmican previous to the 18th century, it was developed as a food source made out of animal meat, the fats, and sometimes even things like berries, service berries, chokecherries, or even something like currants. And the fats that were included in pemmican were usually softer, more tasty fats. This kind of pemmican wasn't necessarily good for long-term storage. It was really intended to taste better, to make it more edible. Right at the turn of the 19th century, pemmican was reformulated specifically for long-term storage. So the soft fats that made the very, very highly edible pemmican, that was changed. And they brought in the much harder internal fats from inside of the bison. Now they formulated this with about a 50-50 mix of the softer fats to give it just the right kind of texture. But this new formulation was made so that the pemmican could last for years, especially if it was kept very dry. So this new pemmican could easily last a year or two, or maybe even a decade. When we look at the ratio of the amount of cargo per man, it's very interesting. A sailor in the 18th century moving goods from, say, North America to Europe, he can usually do about 10 or 20 tons per man in a ship. By comparison, a voyageur in the time period can only take about 500 pounds. It's about 40 times more efficient for a sailor to move goods than it is that poor voyageur's. He's got a very hard job. Pemmican comes onto the stage here in the late 18th century, Before that, there's certainly a lot of fur trade happening, and that fur trade is powered by cornmeal and lard. It wasn't until this late 18th century time period that we have the technological leap of pemmican coming onto the scene. Now this is incredible. The ability of the voyagers to travel so much farther on pemmican than they could on the cornmeal and lard. So how much of a technological leap was this? The voyagers in the time period had contests. They would paddle across lakes for long distances. Before pemmican becomes the food source, generally the top speed at which a voyager could paddle was 40 times a minute. When pemmican comes onto the scene, it moves up to 60. That is a tremendous increase in speed. So that's why pemmican is so very, very important. Without it, you could not do this trade. It wouldn't be possible. Pemmican isn't just an incredibly dense food source, it's an energy boost. This makes it so that the voyagers can endure much longer voyages. Pemmican starts off as a small concept in the 1780s and 1790s, but it becomes a big industry by the time we get into the early 19th century. Not only does it help trade happen, but it becomes a major trade item. It gets traded to people like the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. It is big business, and it's not just used for trade right there in that area, but it's used by explorers all over in the Northern Hemisphere. If you want to go to the North Pole, you eat pemmican. Pemmican in the time period was not known for being a wonderfully palatable food source. Now, that's kind of important for a survival food. You don't want it to be really, really good, so you eat it all up at once. You really could not do that with pemmican. It was good in that you could eat it raw if you needed to. And there were times that people wanted to paddle for long periods of time and they would eat it raw as they were paddling. You can't do that with just any food source. But normally to make it more, let's say, edible, they would turn it into dishes. They would use it as an ingredient. They had a soup called rubaboo, and they also had a stew that they would make that we'd call rousseau. Anything you can add to this, cornmeal, root vegetables, ship's biscuits, any of these will make it a much tastier meal. Here's part of a narrative from 1790. On the banks of the river there were plenty of wild onions, which when mixed up with our pemmican was a great improvement to it. It's been almost a decade since we did our first series on pemmican, and there's been a great resurgence in the interest in pemmican in the last few years. It doesn't matter whether you're a hunter, a hiker, anyone looking for this wonderful, powerful food source, pemmican is still the ultimate survival food. Imagine you're on a 2-month expedition into the wilderness and all you have to eat is salt pork, dried peas, and ship's biscuit. This is the life of the French voyageur in the late 18th century. They're living a life where they're going into the frontier constantly, going with large boats, large canoes, and going into the frontier to trade for furs with the Native Americans. Rivers and lakes of this time period were the superhighways. They're the way that people can get into the deep frontier in North America to access these markets that they would never be able to get to in any other way. They're using birch bark canoes. They're also using bateaux made of regular wooden planks. They're being manned by these voyageurs and boatmen. And it takes a special kind of person to be able to do this job. You can imagine going into the frontier. It's hard enough to live in the woods, but you also have to paddle or work these boats 12 and 16 hours a day. Some of the most difficult physical labor possible in a very dangerous environment. Our French-Canadian voyageurs are from Quebec, and yet the area they're working within extends much further west, further south, and even further north. The region in which they're working in is huge. They are the long-haul truckers of the late 18th century. Their travels could take them easily 1,000 miles into the wilderness. There are different boats for different jobs, but there are many things that are happening on the frontier. People are taking goods out, sometimes taking people out. At times they're ferrying people across rivers or across large lakes. And it's an arduous job. Now, you're doing this job and you don't have a lot of room for provision, but you have to take along enough to survive upon completely. The food you bring along has to meet a lot of different requirements. It has to be something that's very dense, has a lot of energy in it, is easy to keep in a edible form. It can't be damaged by temperature or a little bit of dampness. It takes a special kind of food to fuel this journey. Your cooking equipment is also a major problem. You can't bring along an entire stove and 14 pots and dishes to do this. It has to be all happening in one pot. So what meets all these requirements? There's a wonderful journal from 1795 by Isaac Weld, and he travels through the United States and in Lower Canada, and he gives us a wonderful description of this particular setting. He says, on setting out, each man is furnished with a certain allowance of salted pork, biscuit, peas, and brandy. The peas and biscuit they boil with some pork into a porridge, and a large vessel full of it is generally kept at the head of the bateau for the use of the crew when they stop in the course of the day. These men are surviving on this one dish that they make once a day. They boil up salt pork with peas and ship's biscuit into this solid sort of porridge that they can therefore sample all throughout the day to keep them going. Can you imagine this pot full of green, strange porridge in the front of your boat, and whenever you get hungry, you go up and you fill up your bowl, you eat that, and you get right back to work. This might seem like a strange food for us today, and it is to a certain extent. Imagine your boat or your canoe has barrels of salt pork in it, and salt pork is exactly that and nothing else. It is pork that is submerged in salt, and we're using the entire pig at times. You might even find a hog's head in your barrel of salt pork. It's not just a particular cut, but the entire animal. Salt pork was a huge industry in the 18th century because this provision was so important, not only for sailors on the ocean, but for inland provision, like for our voyageurs, or just regular households. Some people are surviving on salt pork the entire year, shunning fresh provisions because they could sell those off at a better price. Salt pork is prepared by butchering your hog and lightly salting the meat, letting all the blood drain out of it. The salt is packed around every single piece and it's tightly put into a barrel. And this salt pork can last for up to a year, possibly longer. There are a few references in the 18th century to people eating their salt pork raw. They basically just knock all the salt off of it and eat it as it is. But that's an emergency kind of setting. I definitely wouldn't suggest that for anyone. Most of our recipes in the 18th century use salt pork, and they soak it in fresh water, changing the water several times to make it less salty. This dish is easy to prepare, but it does have several steps to it. First off, we're going to start off with our salt pork. Our salt pork has to be soaked, and I'm going to soak this salt pork overnight and then cut it up into nice gobbets, a small edible bite-sized piece. This recipe is made to cook up and serve in one vessel. So we're going to start off with cold water, add our salt pork to it, and bring it to a boil. Once that's brought to a boil, we're going to put in our also soaked dried peas. And here we're going to be using split peas. They might have had whole peas. There are times when they might have used beans instead. Again, we have to get those pre-soaked also. Once our pork and our peas are boiling in our vessel, we're just going to leave that boil for an hour or so. And once that's started to break up, then we add our ship's biscuit. And this is going to give us another nice texture in here. The ship's biscuit is another important component to this, and it's going to add a lot of calories to it. It is one of those classic ship's provisions and provision that can be used for a long time, as long as it's kept dry. And here we're going to pound it up into bits. We could pound the ship's biscuit all the way up into a flour and just use it as a thickener, but we're going to leave these chunks a little bigger, and that will give us a nice texture and feel. It doesn't need to boil too long once it's got the ship's biscuit in it. Normally about 20 minutes, a half hour. We don't want to get those ship's biscuits so they're too soft. If you've been on the channel before, you know we've talked about pemmican, and pemmican is really important for the same set of people. But this pemmican is what comes in after this dish. Pemmican actually replaces salt pork in so much of the provision of the voyageurs and the people that are doing that kind of a job. Pemmican is even more dense and more powerful of food to bring along. But salt pork is what there was before pemmican was really discovered to be even better. Isaac Weld, who wrote this text, also describes our voyageurs in great detail. And he gives us some wonderful pictures talking about how they like to sing as they canoe along, about how they sleep at night. They just sleep on the grass with their short blankets. They don't have a blanket that covers themselves. And even when it rains, they just sleep out in the rain. And they really enjoy their job. Even though it's hard, it probably doesn't pay well. Certainly the food doesn't look necessarily delicious, but they would much rather be doing this job than being a simple farmer. It's very interesting to compare the voyageurs to something like the cowboys. The heyday of the cowboy is only like a 10 or a 15-year time period, whereas voyageurs were important from the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th century, an almost 200-year time span when these men working in the frontier were an important part of the economy. When trains and other kinds of transport become popular in the middle of the 19th century, the occupation of the voyageur disappears. Our voyageur stew is ready to try out. It's still nice and hot. And you know, it doesn't necessarily look terribly appetizing, but I'll bet after a day of canoeing in the wilderness, this would hit the spot. Well, it's really got some wonderful flavors. You don't need any seasoning or salt. There's enough salt that comes in with the salt pork. The ship's biscuit has still got a wonderful texture in here. It might not look appetizing, but it's very, very good.